Hello. Hello everybody, hopefully you can hear me. It's all coming through well and good. You never know. Well, people are saying they're hearing voices. Well, this is a good thing, I think, at least in this case. Just checking, waiting for the chat to catch up to tell me if you can actually hear me all. Yeah, people can hear me, that's good. Yeah, sorry, Christopher Abernathy. I realised at the last minute my magnificent hat collection is in the Conservatory, and quite frankly, I can't be bothered to go and get one. So, let us commence with the questions. Of course, this is the, well, not technically mid-month stream, but to be perfectly honest, I was completely shattered last weekend, and, well, apart from the fact I'm running on chocolate and iron brew, I probably would be just as shattered this weekend. But there's a few things to do, obviously, today. Mostly, though, it's going to be all taking questions from the chat. If I do seem slightly phased at points, that's probably because I am still a bit tired. I'm running mostly on sugar. But yeah, next week is going to be the Patreon dry dock, so that'll be questions pre-registered by the patrons first. But today, we get to just go ahead with taking questions from you lot straight off the bat. So I've got my little notepad open to copy any relevant questions out. So Colin Cameron asks, can you tell the reindeer sub-story? If it's the one I'm thinking about, I think that's from World War II, where you have, I believe it was a Royal Navy submarine shows up in Murmansk or Arkhangelsk, one of the Russian ports on the Arctic convoys, and amongst the various gifts that the Russians are given, the Russians give to the Royal Navy, as kind of a thank you for bringing them all the supplies and everything, they get given a reindeer. Or possibly they adopt a reindeer, but I've heard different versions of it. But in any case, they end up lowering the poor animal into the submarine via the torpedo reloading hatch, and it then spends a bemused several weeks bouncing back and forth inside the submarine as they make their way back to the UK, with the crew feeding it, etc. But then it becomes fairly apparent that, reindeer are in fact fairly large, and they're not exactly the easiest animals to keep in the close confines of a sub. So once they get back to the UK, the reindeer, I suspect rather gratefully, is lifted back out and lives out quite a happy life in the UK, from what I recall. So, yeah, that's off the top of my head, but I think that's generally what was going on with that. Charlemagne 038 asks, why did the US stop using clipper bows, as it seems strange that they used it for every class and never built ships from the New Mexicos until the interwar period? So, I mean, bow shapes in general, but with the US Navy specifically, they had originally, obviously, you have the clipper bow, the overhanging bow, if you like, whatever you want to call it, or some variation thereof, on Age of Sail ships. And in most navies, that kind of goes away gradually with the ironclad era. In the US Navy, because apart from new Ironsides, they don't really have any major ironclads, it kind of just stops until after the American Civil War, until they start building proper warships again. Now, where warships have full sail rigs and need bowsprits, you do end up with something at least resembling a clipper bow, i.e. an overhanging bow. But on capital ships, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, you either end up with a straight bow or even a bow that actually rakes backwards slightly, and that's usually to do with the presence of the ram below the water. But then they send the Great White Fleet out, and the Great White Fleet demonstrates a number of things, but one of the things it demonstrates back to the US Navy itself is that the bows that they currently have are not sufficient. The ships of the Great White Fleet are taking far too much water over the bows. And when they come back, that's one of the things that gets fed back into new US design criteria. So they need more freeboard forward and they need better shaped bows. The problem is that the first few classes of Dreadnought are either under construction or have had their designs pretty much finalized. So when you see the later classes of Dreadnought, so things like the Wyomings, and then moving on into the New York, Texas, Nevada, Oklahoma, you gradually see the bow shape of US Navy capital ships changing. And the ultimate expression of that, at least as you say for the sort of 1910s dreadnoughts and then going into the interwar period, is a very overhanging clipper type bow, which it doesn't completely go away. There is a little bit of overhang on the fast battleships, but it kind of does disappear again. And there's a few reasons for that, part of which is just the hydrodynamics of the hull design, which make, at least in theory, some of it a bit unnecessary, although the Iowas probably would have thanked you for it. But also because the newer ships are much larger, 35,000 tonners as opposed to anything else, then, and the Iowas obviously technically start off as 45,000 tonners, the need for a bow of that shape, especially given the sea conditions they're most likely expected to run into in the Pacific, is not as pronounced as it was when perhaps in the late 1900s, early 1910s, they were thinking more about possibly having to fight in the Atlantic. You see a kind of straight bow, for example, on the Scharnhorsts when they're first built, and then that gets corrected to what the Germans call an Atlantic bow. So what people might think of as a clipper bow, but basically, a pointed, overhanging bow to deal with Atlantic sea conditions. So it's basically just changes and upgrades to the size, shape, speed, and layout of, ship design in general for the US Navy. Thank you very much, Girk the Magnificent. SB says, a conservatory, just how British are you, Drake? Well, in Britain, if you want... Well, okay. There's a little bit off topic from naval history, but it's the general chat, so why not? In Britain, the weather is usually not that pleasant. Certainly not pleasant enough to be just generally out and about in your garden. And unless you're lucky enough to live well off in the countryside, which at least up until the last couple of years in the era of home working really wasn't an option for a lot of British people, you had to live within a fairly close commuting distance of your work. And that meant you either lived in an urban area or in the suburbs. And those kind of properties don't tend to have very large gardens because, well, we're not exactly a very large island to start with. And so if you can spend time out in your garden, but if you want to expand your house, you can look to extend your house if there's the space, but there's all sorts of planning restrictions and regulations over it. It can be quite expensive. You have to get planning permission from the local council, etc., etc. But if you want a bit more livable space and you don't have the money or you don't necessarily want to go through all the rigmarole of full planning permission from the council, you can go for a conservatory, which is effectively a kind of a greenhouse that is attached to your property for the most part. Some people have fancy ones with built-up walls and things like that, but most of the time it's mostly made of panelled glass. And those don't require full planning permission within certain boundaries. So nowadays you can, they did change the law in the mid-2010s, but nowadays you can go up to 3 meters from the back of your house without any planning permission, and you can go the full width of your house without any planning permission. You can't go round the side, round the front, beyond the width of your house, or further back from that without needing some kind of permission. And then you can go up to 4 meters away from your house going backwards with a limited form of planning permission because it's a permitted development, i.e. With normal planning permission, you have to apply and justify to the council why you want to do this, i.e. there's a presumption that if you don't give them all the evidence, they will say no, whereas with the planning permission you need for that, for a 4-metre depth conservatory, at least in London, then you don't need to do that. You need to tell them what you're doing, show them what you're doing, but the presumption in law is that they will say yes, and basically they have to come up with a good reason as to why they're going to say no. And combine that with the fact that it's raining quite a lot of the time, and parts of the time it's cold, etc. A lot of people in the UK end up sticking up a conservatory because it's the, relatively speaking, cheaper and easier option to have a nice big room that they can enjoy themselves in. Still, it is Britain, and as you might imagine, a big glass room, even if it's sort of double glazed, it can lose a lot of heat very quickly. So the idea of it being livable, unless you're prepared to put an awful lot into heating it, or you're prepared to put like double glazing, etc., or triple glazing, that can be a bit ambitious in the winter. And during the summer, well, it's literally a greenhouse. So it's one of those things that's a nice idea in principle, but unless you put a lot of work into it, it's probably only really usable about 4 months out of every year. My one, for example, I've strung up effectively what's a series of sails in the roof to deflect the heat, so it actually becomes usable during the summer as well. I'm still working on how to make it comfortable in the winter. I recently put in an electric radiator to keep it from freezing, but it also has insulation benefits to the house because it acts as effectively a giant bubble wrap around at least part of the house, which means that you don't have to worry about so much about heating bills, which is quite nice. Anyway, that's probably enough about me and my conservatory. If the new Wi-Fi works well enough, I might end up doing some streams from there. Some of you might remember the very earliest streams I did were from there, but that involved me running a 50-foot Cat 5 Ethernet cable out to my laptop, which just got annoying after a while. But there you go. Anyway, let's get a drink. And do a bit of a scroll back up. Ludwig the Burb asks, did battleships or larger ships ever use high explosive rounds on each other, and did they ever use their big guns to shoot smaller ones like destroyers or torpedo boats? The latter far more often. Yes, there were quite a lot of small ships engaged by battleships using their big guns. Obviously at the Battle of Samar, Johnston got shot up quite a bit by Congo and Yamato. Various battles of Guadalcanal, main battery guns were used on destroyers and such, like Battle of Jutland. Quite a number of different ships tried to use their main batteries on destroyers with varying results. Iron Duke, unsurprisingly, with its aimbot going, thank you very much, Alan M., was able to hit and destroy a German torpedo boat. HMS Spitfire managed to ram Nassau in a cunning move, because it meant that although Nassau tried to finish it off with a full broadside of 11-inch guns, it was actually physically too close for the guns to depress far enough, and Spitfire managed to make off with a very, very mangled superstructure and a chunk of Nassau's armour. So that did happen a reasonable amount. In terms of battleships and other large ships using high explosive rounds on each other, it did happen occasionally, but usually only by mistake, because high explosive rounds, at least in the Dreadnought era, not counting the pre-Dreadnought era, weren't massively effective. They could kill people, sure, they could damage systems, sure, but they couldn't actually really compromise the fighting integrity of the ship in question. So When it did happen, it was usually by mistake, or very, very rarely when someone didn't have any other kind of shell to use. And so, for example, when Kirishima had its first opening shots at South Dakota, and the night before when Hiei and Kirishima hit San Francisco, both of those times they were actually using the modified Type 3 bombardment shells, but they effectively count high explosive and then also high explosive shells before finally managing to switch over to armor piercing. And even when you look at San Francisco, yes, she was completely shot to pieces in her upper works by that incoming fire. But by all rights, as a heavy cruiser facing off at close range against a battle cruiser, she should have been sunk very easily. And she wasn't, because the high explosive shells, the Type 3s, weren't doing the kind of deep penetrating damage that AP shells could. And the same with South Dakota. Some, not all, but some of her survival is down to the fact that some of the early hits were just high explosive shells, which meant everything was on fire up top and she couldn't see to fight, but she also wasn't in any significant danger of sinking. Jim Smith, any chance of getting Naval Institute Press to do a reprint of US amphibious ships and craft illustrated design history by Norman Friedman, as with Russian and Soviet battleships? So USNI is in the process of reprinting most, if not all, of the illustrated design histories by Norman Friedman. I know, for instance, that the US battleships, which is one that's currently available in a new reprint, that is all based on a first edition version that I sent off to them to be cannibalized, because unfortunately for older books, that's how you had to reprints. Digital master copies didn't exist back then. And I know cruisers and destroyers are definitely up there. I think submarines are on there as well. So whilst I couldn't swear to it 100%, I'm 99.99999% sure that amphibious ships and craft will be coming. If they're not, I think I might have a decent copy somewhere I can send to them to turn into the next reprint. Thank you, Kevin Ree. Thank you very much. Hello, Dr. Clark. Knight6831 says, why do people overlook manpower when people, including yourself sadly, when thinking of Hood or Vanguard, were around for the Falklands? It's not so much an issue of overlooking the manpower requirements, to be honest, because one of the things that you'll find when you do a fair bit of digging into the Falklands, which I have done, and I know Dr. Clark's done a lot more of, when you talk to people who are either around for the Falklands or were serving in the Navy or had just served in the Navy, the one thing you didn't have to worry about when it came to the Falklands War was manpower for the Navy. You had obviously the existing manpower, and if a ship had been kept in the fleet like Hood or Vanguard, then the Royal Navy would have cut its cloth to ensure that it had the men to crew it. Recruit, they can go to Parliament and say we need X number of people to crew Y number of ships because this is how many people we need in the fleet. But also, there were an awful lot of people who had recently retired from Royal Navy service, and people who maybe had retired a little bit further back, who showed up within hours or days of the Falklands War being declared, such as it was, volunteering to come back into the Navy. And quite a number of them were accepted, and still more, including one or two I've been able to talk to, were turned away, basically because the Royal Navy had more volunteers, more manpower for its ships than it actually had berths on the ships. So, if they'd managed to expedite the recommissioning of Tiger or Blake, those people would have been on those ships. And likewise, if, for instance, Vanguard or Hood had been in some kind of reserve, I'm 99% sure they would have had enough people to crew it, even if it was a scratch crew. It's one of the things you don't, as I say, is one of the few things the Royal Navy didn't have to worry about when it came to the Falklands. And speaking of that, since next year, well, in 6 days, is going to be the Falklands, for the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, I will be... I'm not saying it's... I wouldn't say I'm breaking the rule, because, of course, most of you know I have a rule on the channel that I don't do videos after that cover ships built after the 1950 cutoff, because it gets involved in far too many issues. However, you will also know, hopefully, that I did a long and quite pleasant interview with Captain Larry Seacrest, who of course was captain of USS Iowa in the 1980s. And I view that as, I wouldn't say necessarily a get-out clause, because after all, it is my own rule. I can change it if I want. But I view it as a way of avoiding most of the issues in question, the reasons why I normally don't go beyond the 1950s, because, you know, at that point, I'm not the one presenting my view or what my research says, and obviously there are issues of like what's classified and what isn't as well. I'm simply giving a platform to someone else who did actually do it for real. In that case, obviously Captain Seacrest. You know, there's in that one interview, he told us far more about what it's like to be the captain of an Iowa class battleship in the 1980s than I ever could have put together, no matter how much research I did. Unless, you know, I interviewed him offline and then just repeat it back to you, but what would be the fun in that? So, in view of that, what I'm thinking of doing is maybe putting a few videos together, maybe in sort of May, June time, where we will take a look at the Falklands War, but again, it will be taking a look at the Falklands War through the eyes of people who were actually there. You know, interview people who were commanding ships, commanding parts of the task force, or were just crewmen aboard the ships, and basically let them tell their stories, and I just act as the host. So if that seems like a good idea, I will be putting that idea out to people a bit more formally later on down the line, see what people think about it. But I suppose it's just as well to start letting people know that's where my thought process is going at the moment. Right, so where were we? Mark Bass, HMS Warrior versus a World War II Liberty ship. Now that's an interesting one, because most Liberty ships don't have that heavy an armament. They might have a 3 or 4 inch gun, but I think that's probably about the heaviest that most Liberty ships carry, and they usually didn't carry more than 1 or 2 of those. Then, and obviously they have some light AA, which will be very good at clearing decks, but isn't going to get through 4.5 inches of iron. At the same time, you know, they've got merchant grade steel hulls, which probably aren't going to provide a tremendous amount of protection against 68-pound shot. And weirdly enough, they're approximately the same speed, although I have a feeling Liberty ships might be a fraction faster if they choose to go all out. And of course, Warrior's maximum speed is with sails and steam, so the light weaponry on a Liberty ship could knock out those. So I mean, if it was kind of you spawn them 500 yards away from each other, then Warrior's probably still got the firepower to do some serious damage to the Liberty ship and get one over on it. But if it was a kind of they sight each other on the horizon and a chase ensues, I think the Liberty ship could just get away, or at least engineer circumstances enough that they could get away. George Crabbe says interview jingles best time in the Royal Navy. Well, yeah, that could do that as well. That would be quite interesting. I wonder if Jingles will be up for that. I mean, I know I put him in touch with the ops room, so I know he was happy to talk about that there. So yeah, it might be worth an idea. UNSC forward on to Dawn. Following this on from this week's Wednesday special, which World War One era battleships or battlecruisers that weren't modernised for World War Two would you modernise, and in what way? Well, I mean, one of the obvious answers would be Repulse. Obviously, she didn't get modernised the way that Renown did. If she had been, would it have helped Forced? Maybe. Can never really tell with that kind of thing. I mean, she would have been a lot tougher of a customer with 24.5-inch guns and a lot more pom-poms than she was with the slightly odd armament that she actually ended up going into that operation with. But yeah, Repulse is an obvious candidate because we know that Renown turned out very well. Kaiser Brockton. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to your question in a second. But yeah, following on from that, other battleships and battlecruisers from World War One that weren't modernised. Well, the German ships obviously were all scuttled or broken up, so you couldn't. But if they hadn't been, then if, say, something like the Mackensons had been completed, because some of the hulls were in the water, if they'd completed those post-World War One, they could have been kind of on a par with the Dunkirks. No, actually not on a par with Dunkirk, probably more on a par with Strasbourg. If they'd been fully refitted and modernised, so they could have been made into somewhat useful capital ships for the Second World War. Japan pretty much did modernise all their World War One era ships to some degree or other. The Americans ended up modernising in the end most of their standards. Yeah, I'm not even going to touch the idea of trying to modernise the Britannias with a 10-foot pole. The Russians did modify and modernise some of the Ganguts. The Italians modernised the Cavours and the Dorias. So, yeah, at that point, the only people you're looking at apart from... Yeah, the only people you're looking at who actually had World War One or World War Two era ships in any significant numbers and didn't necessarily modernise all of them were the British. And if it was... Yeah, if it was down to me, what ships... I mean, they modernised... They modernised the ships they could afford to modernise at the time. So, I mean, yeah, apart from Repulse, the obvious answer is Hood. The other two, Queen Elizabeths, Barham and Malaya. The R's probably wouldn't have benefited all that much from full-on modernisation, I don't think. Tiger, though... I mean, Tiger's one of these perennial questions. People keep asking, would Tiger have been decent refitting World War II? Theoretically, yes. She has the baseline capability that if you up-engined her, up-armoured her, etc., upgraded the gun turrets, she'd probably make a fairly decent cruiser killer. Again, along the lines of something like Strasbourg or a modernised Mackensen. But that's all she would ever be. I mean, maybe in an upgraded state, if they really rejigged her armour scheme, she might be able to try and think about fighting a Scharnhorst. But she is not at a point where you could turn her into a genuine frontline combatant, except, again, unless you did some significant up-armouring, maybe fighting the Dorias or Cavours. So, unlike the Queen Elizabeths, yeah, she's always going to be a second-line ship. And you have the added complication of you now have to maintain a 13.5-inch ammunition supply trained purely for a single vessel. So I think, for the most part, outside of budgetary restrictions, pretty much the World War I ships that could and deserved modernisations were modernised. And apart from the Royal Navy, where it budget was really more of an issue. Pretty much everyone else got what they thought was useful. Coming back to Kaza Brochten's question, saying that the Königsbergs and Nürnbergs are always used as a bad example for being lightly built, but considering that they were meant to be used for coastal defence, are they really that bad? Yes, to be fair, because, I mean, they're still light cruisers. They are supposed to go places other than the coast. And, you know, if you're trying to defend your own coastline with only light cruisers, something's already gone horribly, horribly wrong, and you shouldn't be trying to do that. There's a reason that coastal defence ships generally either are incredibly heavily armoured or incredibly heavily armed. The Königsbergs and Nürnbergs weren't either, and they were designed for a degree of oceanic operations. And the simple fact of the matter is that they weren't even really strong enough to operate in the North Sea, so let alone the Atlantic for any extended period of time. They are just far too lightly built. There's the same problem you have with Glorious and Courageous and Furious. There are lots of reasons why they're built that way. Sure, I can perfectly readily accept that. But at the same time, you know, much like with the Königsbergs and the Nürnbergs, they twist themselves in all sorts of pretzel-like shapes simply from being in a heavy sea state, which that's just a failure of ship design. You know, that you can have a coastal defense ship that's still, even if we accept for a moment that they were purely for coastal defense, which I don't think they were, but even if they were, you can still have a coastal defense ship that won't, you know, start to fall apart the minute you take it across the North Sea. A Sverige, for example, could quite happily cross the North Sea for whatever reason it might want to do so, to say hello to things. Frank Barnwell says the wiki says 1 4-inch stern gun on a Liberty ship. Yeah, by default, but there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of Liberty ships built, and exactly what armament each Liberty ship has tends to vary a bit. They did tend to start upgrading them, the ones that were around for a fair bit. Lightning Wing Dragon Iowa class versus Dreadnought versus CSS Virginia. Yes, that was obviously a humorous question, but I mean the obvious answer is either the Iowa or the Dreadnought accidentally runs over CSS Virginia, probably not even noticing it. In a short but brief battle, the Iowa's always going to win that one. Unless, of course, you mean USS Iowa BB-4, in which case Dreadnought wins. But I have a suspicion you mean, you know, the World War II Iowa class, which is clearly superior to either of the other two. Don Cornell, thank you very much. Also, what is your website? It's drakinifel.co.uk. I haven't had a chance to update it for a little while, but it will be being updated at some point in the future. It currently has a few hundred photos on it, a few articles, a few other bits and pieces, but I do need to get around to updating it in a big way. There's a subscriber who's kindly sent me a list of pretty good naval reference books that are available for free on archive.org, which I need to put up as kind of a link to a reference library. It's just been a very busy few months. I haven't had the chance to get around to doing that, even though I really, really, really should. Darren Marshall asks, would it have been possible for the Italian Royal Navy to plan and carry out an operation similar to that carried out by the British in Taranto? No, for the very simple reason that the Italians didn't have any aircraft carriers, and the British fleet, well, the two major elements of the British fleet that the Italians could find were either in Alexandria or in Gibraltar, both of which were beyond the range of the Italians to launch significant heavy torpedo strikes at from the land-based airfields which they controlled. I suppose in theory you could make an argument that maybe at the height of Rommel's advance into the Western Desert that maybe they could have constructed some kind of forward airbase, and maybe something like an SM-79 might have been able to make it, but that would have involved an awful lot of planning, pulled off very, very quickly. the effort on the build-up probably would have been either intercepted via signals intelligence or spotted by aerial recon, and then they'd have to fight their way or fly their way past the front lines, which would have led to them being spotted quite easily. In order to pull off a Taranto-style raid, you do need the unexpectedness that comes from having a carrier-borne strike that can come in out of the blue, and you also need, therefore, to have carriers, which, as I say, the Italians didn't have. If they'd finished Aquila and Spaviero, then technically there's nothing stopping them from trying, I guess. Charlemagne038, what's your opinion of the naval battle of Salamis? It's a battle I actually quite enjoy. It's one of the earliest naval battles I ever read about, both in terms of, ancient naval battles and in terms of battles I read about. I think I first read about it in detail when I was about 6. It's something I've wanted to do a video on for a while, but again, as with a number of videos people have asked me to do about different US ships, and I've sort of said yes, I will, but I'd kind of like to go and actually see them first. So a more detailed breakdown on the Des Moines class, for instance, that really I want to go and see USS Salem and film on USS Salem before I do that. And for Salamis, there is a trireme I think in Piraeus in Greece. Not an original, but a replica. So if I'm going to do anything about Salamis or, the various naval battles between the Greeks and the Persians, I'd want to be able to go there and film on there first. So video on that basically needs to wait until I can get that done. Hello, Jacob Moss. Yes, well, I will have fun here, and you will have fun with your streaming. Yes, very funny. JC Homeslice says, one of my favourite videos of yours was the A6M0. Do you plan on making more videos about carrier naval aircraft? Yes, I do. There is a long-term one in the works with military aviation history with Chris to talk about the Wildcat. And I do also have another one potentially in the works to talk about the Seafire. But generally speaking, when it comes to naval aircraft, apart from the Swordfish, which I will be doing a video on myself, but when it comes to most naval aircraft, while I could give you, a 5-minute guide to X naval aircraft, I'd prefer to bring you a longer format video that's done with people who specialise in those particular aircraft. Because, as I say, outside of a very few aircraft like the Swordfish, I have got working knowledge, but not one that I'd be comfortable enough to extend to giving people, half an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour talking about it beyond the basics. Animal16365 says, in your video on the Des Moines class cruiser, would they or any other subtypes have made a better cruiser or destroyer killer than a battle cruiser? For their time, yes, because when it comes to engaging most kinds of ships, you have the option of hitting the enemy ship with a lot more firepower than they have, or hitting them a lot faster with a similar caliber weapon. Now, the problem is that, most ship technological advancements tend to come within a few years of each other. So it's more difficult to try and do rapid fire weapons without your enemy coming up with a similar rapid fire weapon in that caliber. Hence why battle cruisers go with bigger guns. Because, there's other things as well. The bigger guns hit harder. They can penetrate armour. Because they're mounted on bigger ships, you can make those ships have armour that will resist the smaller guns that are being fired back at them, and they can outrange the enemy guns. So there's a lot of logic to battle cruisers taking out cruisers, But in the specific context of the mid-1940s, when the US has these auto-loading 8-inch guns and none of their opponents are anywhere close to developing such a weapon, at that point the Des Moines makes more sense as a cruiser killer than a full-on battle cruiser does, because you can produce more of them, and between the sheer rate of fire that they've got and the amount of fire control that they've got, you can pretty much guarantee you're probably going to hit first and hit hard and keep on hitting, at which point you pretty much put that target down as hard, if not harder, than it would be if you were engaging them with something like an Alaska. Ramal asks, can you explain in more detail about US torpedo fire control or computers in World War II? Yes, US torpedo fire control computers. I am actually at the moment in the process of writing a script that covers that, amongst other things. Although whether it's going to be a one-part video or a two-part video, I don't know yet. It's, put it this way, I've only got into March 1942 and I'm already about half an hour's worth of recording in. So yeah, you'll get it at some point sooner or later. Phil Dyson, we all know how awful most British naval aircraft were in World War II. Were there any that were planned and should have been built and may have gone some way to rectify this? Yes, quite a few. I mean, when I get to do the video on the Seafire, you'll hear all about the Seafire that could have been, i.e. the proper navalised version of the Spitfire that wouldn't have broken itself on every third landing and could have been built in 1939 but wasn't due to the demands of the Battle of Britain. So yeah, instead of having to use Fulmars and then later Fireflies and eventually adopting Sea Hurricanes and F4Fs in kind of the mid part of the war, imagine if the Royal Navy had been able to, at least in limited numbers, deploy a properly carrier capable Spitfire from sort of probably in numbers from early 1940 onwards. Of course, you did have the Albacore, which was technically supposed to be the successor to the Swordfish, but you also had the Barracuda, which, I mean, okay, the Barracuda's not as good as the Avenger, but it's certainly a massive step up over the Albacore, and it is a superior platform to the Swordfish, but it's delayed into service because of World War II starting. So, yeah, and I've made this point before, you know, a lot of the fact that the US Navy and the Japanese Navy at the end of 1941 are starting their part in the conflict with aircraft that are fairly superior to most of the offerings that the Royal Navy can put up in the air at that point in time, at least in terms of their paper stats, is because they've had 2.5 years-ish of peacetime development rather than having to freeze designs and basically build what they can as quickly as possible for wartime much earlier, which is what the British have had to do. So i.e. the British are basically almost a generation behind in terms of what they're actually putting out onto the front lines. And not only that, but as I said, pointed out with the Spitfire version, it's not just that they're having to freeze and build whilst iterating in the background, it's also that the specific demands of things like the Battle of Britain have drained resources for naval aviation generally, to the point that even the existing Fleet Air Arm aircraft are having problems finding spares or getting spare parts manufactured because there's so much demand by the RAF in 1940. Charlemagne 038, when will your video of your Kobe HMS Warspite be out? It'll probably be part of a Fun Friday or possibly part of a midweek live stream, either January or February. Again, something that's been sadly on the back burner because of all sorts of things that have been happening over the past few months. Massimo Gubiani asks, "Hey Drac, I noticed that many Royal Navy supply convoys in the Mediterranean were extremely weak in comparison with the threat of the Italian fleet, even the most important ones. What's the reason for this?" Basically, because there were a lot of things that the Royal Navy had to be doing in the Mediterranean, not just escorting convoys, although that was pretty important. When they really went all in, there were some pretty powerful convoy escorts out there. But generally, the Royal Navy worked on the basis of, well, one, obviously their fleet was split between Gibraltar and Alexandria at two ends of the Mediterranean. But two, they worked on the principle of they had more than one thing to do when it came to convoys and all the other stuff they were trying to get done. And they assumed, for the most part correctly, that the Italian Navy had other things to be doing as well as, going after convoys. And therefore only a fraction of the Italian Navy should at any given point be going after said convoys, which meant that only a fraction of the Royal Navy's strength in the Mediterranean would be needed to see off those attacks on said convoys. Of course, as the convoy escort strength waxed and waned, the amount of shipping the Italians could put forward against those convoys also waxed and waned, depending on the exact timing. And some of the clashes, like the Battle of Cape Spartiviento, etc., the direct surface clashes were in direct relation to convoys and the Italian attempts to intercept them. Obviously, for things like Operations Pedestal and Halberd, most of the attacks were done by air, but that was the other issue, which was that as the convoys got closer to Malta, the more intense the air attacks became, because the more aircraft could reach them, and with heavier bomb loads as well, because things like Ju-87s, which both Luftflotte 10 and Fliegerkorps 10, sorry, and the Italian air forces were both using, but a Ju-87 armed with a 500-pound bomb can go a lot further than a Ju-87 armed with a 2,200-pound bomb. So there was a lethal radius around Malta where Axis air power was a lot stronger than it was further out. And since obviously the Royal Navy had lots of different things it needed to do with its ships, they preferred to send a much stronger escort generally for the early portion of the voyage, where it would be much more plausible that the convoy might be intercepted by Italian surface forces, but then a good portion of that force would turn back outside of the range of the worst of the Axis air power, and then a comparatively light escort would continue with the convoy to run into Malta, largely on the basis that a heavy surface attack that was coming into that portion of the convoy would necessarily have to come fairly close to Malta, at which point it could be attacked by aircraft based in Malta, which kind of put the shoe on the other foot in a lot of ways. And you see parallels to that with the Arctic convoys as well, where when they're initially concerned about, if Scharnhorst or Tirpitz or whoever comes out, the early part of the voyage is covered by a lot heavier forces, but then they turn back, mostly out of concern of, if we run a heavy escort on every convoy within range of lots of Axis aircraft, we'll probably end up with a lot more damaged and sunk heavy units than the Germans, or in the Mediterranean's case, the Italians ever will, even if they never move their ships. Lightning Wing Dragon asks, science instead of history, what are your thoughts on the James Webb telescope? And will there ever be a video on the numerous different designs of the North Carolina class battleship? Yeah, on the latter question, yeah, at some point I'm sure I will do a video on the design development history of the North Carolinas, because there's quite a lot of weird and wacky stuff going on with those ships. And of course the last minute change from quad 14s to triple 16s. Thoughts on the James Webb telescope? Well, it'll be interesting to see when the thing actually gets in orbit and starts sending pictures back. I think it was supposed to launch. I remember seeing something about it supposed to be launched today. It'll be incredibly... yes, there you go. I'm just checking. Okay, so the James Webb telescope has successfully... taken up by an Ariane rocket. Flight to orbit lasted just under half an hour. Okay, so it didn't explode on its way up, which, for something that's been in development for a couple of decades, that would have been something of a humiliating setback. But Yeah, I'm intrigued to see how the thing's going to work. Good old Hubble's done an awful lot for us, so I mean, it's just a bit of a pity that they can't bring Hubble back to be a museum piece, but there you go. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what the thing can bring to our understanding of the universe. Even if I must admit, in my engineer's mind, like Hubble looks like an proper orbiting telescope. I know that the James Webb Telescope is far more capable, and I know why it's far more capable. Yeah, I understand all that, but at the same time, Hubble looks like a giant flying telescope. The James Webb, to be honest, it looks more like a homeworld, the computer game Homeworld probe than an actual, proper telescope. But that's just visual impressions, I know. Bert Lattimore, when Prince of Wales and Repulse set sail for the Pacific, if a carrier accompanied them and made it into battle, would it have changed the result? Yeah, well, I've covered that quite a few times, and the thing is, yes, in theory, it could have done, but it's one of these things where you have to look at the situation and admit that everything is so up in the air when it comes to that kind of mass attack scenario that they were facing, that you have to take a step back and say you can't definitively say yes, this would have saved them, or no, it wouldn't, because you can construct various plausible scenarios where the presence of a carrier either just results in, well, they lost a carrier as well, or possibly results in everybody gets back to Singapore safely, or something in between. But certainly it would open up the possibility, because it would allow the fighters, whatever fighters it had, would be able to disrupt the incoming Japanese attacks. And by doing that, you change the whens and wheres and how many's of torpedoes that are being dropped, which is going to influence whether or not those torpedoes hit. And, of course, whether or not the Japanese decide to launch follow-up strikes afterwards. Herr Butterlachs asks, how about more content on the earlier Age of Sail, like the one on the Jesus of Lubeck? Yeah, I have a list of ships that are going to be covered. So, hang on a minute. I've got a much bigger list elsewhere, but I do have a ready access document that tells me some of the more immediately approaching ships. So, basically, apart from the first of the month, which is decided by Patreon vote, the other 5-minute guides are coming off of a list which is strictly basically ships that people have asked for in the comments, but just, literally in the order that I saw them. So that's why the 5-minute guides tend to jump around so much. Occasionally you'll latch onto a theme because, like with the last few weeks, that came to a request where someone said, well, can you talk about the Austro-Hungarian armoured cruisers? Well, it turns out there are only 3 of them, so I did the 3 videos on the 3 ships. But coming up, we are going to talk about HMS Saint Lawrence, the only freshwater first-rate. HMS Duke of Wellington and HMS Temeraire are on there to be covered in the next few months. Just look through, the others are all more modern. They're at least ironclads. Yeah, everything on the more immediate list for the next few months, apart from those 3, are more modern ships. So we are getting at least 3 Age of Sail ships for the 5-minute guides over the next few months, unless, of course, obviously people start voting for more of those on Patreon. The only thing I will say is that the research into older ones, especially things like the Jesus of Lubeck, is a bit harder. I don't mind doing it, but it does take a bit longer to do than it does for some of the newer ships. Because, if you're going to talk about, I don't know, the Florida-class battleships, well, you could look at Friedman's US Battleships Illustrated Design History and get more than enough material for a 5-minute guide just from that. I obviously use more than one source to double check everything, but it's fairly easy to get that kind of stuff. Whereas for something like the Jesus of Lubeck, 95% of all sources that ever talk about it will only ever talk about it in the context of Drake, Hawkins, and the Battle of San Juan de Ulua. Where it came from, how long it had been there, why it was called the Jesus of Lubeck, and what it was doing in British service, etc. All of that is stuff you really have to hunt down the fine details for. Wapen of Hamburg as well. I mean, Wapen of Hamburg was a very interesting one to do, in as much as I couldn't actually find any English language sources in the searches that I did that had anything more than a couple of paragraphs on it. And in the end, I had to go looking for German sources. And then when I found the German sources, I had to try and select one that my basic high school German allowed me to understand probably had a reasonable amount of information on it. And then having acquired that, I then had to go through the process of OCR scanning the text and then putting the text through Google Translate, then trying to work out what on earth Google Translate was saying and make some sense of it, and then cross-correlate it with someone I knew who did actually speak German to see if I got the rough idea. So yeah, some of those old Age of Sail ships can be quite difficult to come up with more than like a minute or two on. John Hart, should Britain have conducted a primarily naval strategy in World War One rather than sending a huge army to Northwest Europe? The former appears to be in keeping with historic naval strategy. If I didn't know any better, I think you're channeling Professor Lambert, who's very definitely of this opinion. And to be honest, the more and more I've thought about it, the more and more I've come to agree with that argument, which is that, and the thing is, it's a very difficult thing to put forward without sounding disrespectful one way or the other, because, you know, there were a lot of people who went and died in the trenches in World War One. I mean, from all the countries involved, and obviously in this particular case from Britain. And of all the wars, I do still see World War One as the greatest unnecessary tragedy, for all sorts of reasons I won't go into here. It's just far too depressing for a live stream. But with that said, you're essentially correct. Britain's historical strategy when it comes to dealing with the European hegemon has not been to go and confront them head on in land warfare in Europe, because Britain doesn't have the resources to do that. If you're going to deploy troops, you do it in support of allies. Okay, fair enough. That's what they did in World War One. And you also do it when you are pushing back against your enemy, once your enemy has been weakened. So you look at, for example, the various wars in Europe against Spain around about the time of the Spanish Armada, plus or minus several decades. And whilst you do see deployments of British troops into Europe, especially into the Netherlands, who are fighting against the Spanish, you only tend to see those deployments after fairly extensive naval activity once the Spanish war efforts have been weakened, mostly by fighting other European powers on land. The Anglo-Dutch wars, you don't see Dutch armies landing in the UK, you don't see British armies landing in the Netherlands. Glorious Revolution, separate matter, but I'm going to put that under the classification of they were invited. And then in the Napoleonic Wars, again, whilst you do have the Peninsular Campaign, you do obviously have the Battle of Waterloo, etc., those are the culminations of Britain spending a lot of money to get Austria, Spain at various points, Prussia, Russia, pretty much everybody who had a land army in Europe to fight the French first, and then move in with what is still a relatively small number of troops compared to the sheer numbers that you see at something like Austerlitz. And those troops are basically acting as, also being quite heavily supported by the Navy, but they're acting as kind of a final decisive blow on top of the major grinding efforts that have been put in by the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy spends most of the 19th century acting as, again, the strategic control element, and then the troops are put into at the fulcrum. And that's pretty much what the British Expeditionary Force is designed to be. The British Expeditionary Force is not designed to fight a knockdown, drag-out European land war. It ends up having to do that, and then it ends up being mostly cut to pieces as a result, and then you have the volunteer army, and then you have the trench warfare, the Somme, etc., etc., all the stuff we know about from World War One. But the idea of, committing the vast majority of Britain's manpower into fighting a long, grinding land campaign in Europe is completely an antithesis of everything that Britain's ever done before. The problem you get when trying to reevaluate it is because you're effectively saying, well, what if we completely redo World War One in a way that is completely different to how we know it went? Everything from something like the Battle of the Marne, where the Germans are stopped in their advance on Paris, and most histories give the British Expeditionary Force a fairly critical role to play in that. If the British Expeditionary Force hadn't been deployed in 1914, would the Germans have kept on pressing on at the Marne? You can point to logistics issues and say they were really strung out. They were. But being really strung out hasn't necessarily stopped armies in the past when they're that close to victory. Also, not having the support of the BEF, would that have demoralised the French troops? Would they have fought harder to stop the Germans reenacting the Franco-Prussian War again? Who knows? So something as simple as and as early as the Battle of the Marne, well, again, I'm a naval person. I'm not a land warfare person. Maybe there are people out there who know the land warfare element of World War One better than me, who can say one way or another, would the BEF not being there in France, how would that have affected the Battle of the Marne? Would the war have just ended a few weeks later with the Germans taking Paris, or would it still have somewhat resembled the trench warfare that we know? And then you expand beyond that. What does Britain do with the BEF? What does the Royal Navy do? Whatever they end up doing, it would be more reflective of the historical paradigm that Britain finds itself involved in it when it comes to Europe. But it's basic to rewrite the entire history of World War One it's something of such huge scope and scale. I think you probably have to do maybe a PhD or several to try and narrow down even the most likely forms of how it could have gone, let alone a single preferred timeline, if you like. Yeah, right. Ramal, what is more fitting to Royal Navy carriers in late World War II, the F6F Hellcat or the Sea Fury? Well, the Sea Fury is manufactured in the UK for obvious reasons. It's a later aircraft than the Hellcat, and it is a far more capable aircraft than the Hellcat. When you evaluate the Sea Fury, most people, if they're doing like one-on-one evaluations, tend to evaluate it alongside something like the F8F, the Bearcat, which is fair because, as I say, the Sea Fury is a few years later than the Hellcat, and there's a few years difference between the Hellcat and the Skua. So that tells you how quickly aircraft technology is advancing at the time. But to be sort of more contemporaneous, the Hellcat, compared to the Seafire, the Royal Navy did prefer to deploy the Seafire, although I suspect some of the pilots, given how often the Seafire broke, might have preferred the Hellcat. Phil Dyson, did the Italians ever plan to build carriers? Yes, they had ideas and plans kept coming up in the interwar period about how to build a carrier, what carrier would look like. They never got around to building it, partly because of budgetary constraints, partly because the ambitions of Mussolini and how he wanted to use the Italian forces didn't extend to what he saw as the use of carriers. And as I mentioned earlier, they were building Aquila and Sparviero later on in the war. So there is all of that to consider. So yes, they planned for it. They did start building some of them, but they never actually got round to doing one, at least, until after the end of World War II. They subsequently, surprisingly enough, actually have maintained a small but surprisingly capable force of light carriers almost ever since then, whilst being part of NATO. Clay Pigeon. In addition to my earlier question about French age of sail gunnery practices, just how much more formidable were late age of sail ships versus early ones? Right, so if you're talking about late, i.e. 1830s, 1840s, they were considerably more formidable. They were larger, thanks to various revolutions in how to construct ships, diagonal cross bracing, things like that, which generally most people lump under what they call the Seppings and Simmons reforms. So if you look at, say, Trafalgar, the standard ship is the 74, whereas by the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there's 84 and 92 gun ships, which are now, before would have been considered either heavy third rates or second rates, but now two-decker 84s and 92s are the standard. They've basically replaced the 74. They're much more strongly built, thanks to these advances in designs. The guns they're carrying are also a lot more powerful. The 32-pounder is still there, but following on a trend that's, I suppose, technically started by the United States, people start to look at all 32-pounder armament, or at least 32 and 24-pounder armament, so that the 18-pounders, the 12-pounders on the capital ships start to disappear. Carronades in relatively large numbers start to appear on the upper decks where they can't get a 32 or a 24, or sometimes they are 32 or 24, but carronades rather than cannons. They've got shell guns. You start to see the deployment of some larger guns in the lower spaces, so like the 64-pounder, the one that is it the 64 or 68-pounder? Anyway, the 60-something pounder that's on HMS Warrior, that first is deployed on actual the last generation of sail ships of the line. So they've got all of these advantages. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're far more heavily armed. They've got more guns as well. The really, really big first rates that are being built are kind of 130, 140, 150 gunners, and comfortable, manoeuvrable, fast 140, 150 gunners at that. So, Santissima Trinidad at the Battle of Trafalgar, technically 144 guns, but also quite slow, not very agile, and a large number of those upper guns are quite light. Whereas if you put her up against the biggest warships in the world, probably Britannia, one of the French ones, and a comparable British one that's launched shortly thereafter, they would take Santissima Trinidad apart in fairly short order with much more rapidly firing, much heavier guns, and they'd be much better equipped to stand up to the incoming fire as well. Rule Britannia, spelt the French way, asks, the difference between a 5-inch gun mounting and a 6-inch gun mounting tends to be huge, but between a 6-inch or an 8-inch or 4-inch and 5-inch it isn't so significant. Why does this tend to be the case? It depends what types of guns you're looking at. The main thing is that generally a 6-inch gun tends to be a long barrel anti-shipping weapon. There's obviously the square cube law involved as well, but as I say, the 6-inch gun mount normally is a long barrel anti-shipping weapon. The 5-inch gun mount, whilst sometimes, especially in World War I, will also be a long barreled anti-shipping weapon, and at that point the difference between the two actually isn't that great. So if you look at the 5-inch casement mounted guns on most of the US standards versus the 6-inch casement mounted guns on most of the British dreadnoughts, at least after the Orion class, well, there's not actually a lot of difference between those. But once you get into dual purpose gun mountings and destroyer gun mountings, where they are very much mountings, and in the 5-inch 38 case shorter barrel weapons, then compare that to a full-on anti-shipping weapon in a actual armoured turret, then there is quite a significant difference. Whereas 4-inch and 5-inch guns tend to, in both cases, be mountings, usually anti-aircraft or dual-purpose mountings. So there's a lot more similarities. And then again, with the 6 and the 8-inch, they're both long-barreled, armoured turret-mounted, unless you're the Japanese, anti-shipping weapons. So the similarities between those two pairs tend to be a lot more than between the 5 and the 6, which tends to be the dividing line between dual-purpose and single-purpose. John Driscoll, what difference, if any, would it have made if the USA had entered the Second World War during October 1939? Well, quite a lot. I mean, it's a bit of an odd one because the US would be launching into war without the intervening 2.5 years of upgrades and experience and cribbing details off of, watching the war unfold. They wouldn't have Hornet. Wasp would barely be ready for duty, and they also wouldn't have the North Carolinas, so they'd be going to war with 0 fast battleships or fast capital units of any kind apart from the carriers. But on the other hand, it would mean the Germans would have a lot tougher time of it in the Atlantic, because if we're assuming that by going to war in October or September, October 39, they're going to war with Germany and then later Italy, and the Japanese aren't getting involved until historically in December 41, it could have huge ramifications for the outcome of the war navally. Because I say, well, one thing, there's going to be a lot more escorts for the convoys starting off early, so the German U-boat's going to have a harder time of it. When it comes to operations perhaps in the North Sea, but you're going to have not just, obviously, the Royal Navy trying to fend the Germans off in Norway. In theory, you should have at least some US presence. And at that point, I think having US carriers available with their large air groups, even if perhaps the aircraft themselves are not going to be that brilliant in 39 or 40. I mean, in 40, they're starting to bring in the Wildcat. But just the sheer numbers of strike aircraft and fighters that the US can bring to bear is probably going to have a significant impact in the early stages of the Norwegian campaign. And given that, they did try and bomb the British carriers, but the Germans didn't succeed in hitting any of the British carriers. So, I was going to say the slight weaknesses of the US unarmoured flight decks wouldn't be too much of an issue, but then again, Ark Royal didn't have an armoured flight deck either, and she was present. So I suppose there's that. The Royal Navy would be able... I suppose the Royal Navy could then deploy more of its fast capital units to Norway in order to help fend off the Germans, because they could count on more heavy backup from the US taking up the slack further back. Because let's face it, having Renown, Repulse and Hood, in Nelson and Rodney for that matter, if you really want, or some of the Queen Elizabeths, having them pile in to the Norwegian campaign with their increased mobility, with standards taking their place further back in the Atlantic and in the home fleet, would be a much better way of doing things than sending the standards in to try and negotiate their way around Norway whilst the faster ships sit at home and wait for something to happen. And then when France... I mean, the interesting thing is when France gets knocked out of the war, because, that's a land campaign, there's not a lot the Navy's going to do to affect that initially. It brings up an interesting issue, because then what happens with things like Mers el Kabir? Because if you've got the US Navy and the Royal Navy allied, the threat of the French Navy potentially being taken over by the Germans and the Italians it's still there, but it's significantly less, because there's just so many more ships facing off against them. So you'd still probably have some kind of attempt to get the French to not, at least as far as the Allies understand it, hand their ships over to control of the Germans. But whether it would be quite as urgent and whether it would escalate quite as badly as it did at Mers-el-Kabir is another matter entirely. It might not do so. And that could have some fairly significant knock-on effects. And then, of course, you've got the fact that in the Mediterranean, again, if the US Navy has got carriers and battleships and cruisers backing up the Royal Navy in the North Sea, the forces in the Mediterranean could also be a lot stronger. Although which forces the US Navy would deploy to the Mediterranean is another matter. Again, you probably wouldn't want to put slow standard battleships into the Mediterranean where speed is of the essence. Most of the Italian fleet is very quick. But again, you can use them on convoy escorts, including things like Pedestal and Halberd and Vigorous, which frees up the faster Royal Navy capital ships to try and maybe go hunting the Italian Navy. So yeah, it could make an absolutely huge difference, but who loses what ships where and when, it's definitely going to put the Axis on the back foot. The flip side of that is, of course, if the US Navy is going into the end of 1941 with 2.5 years of war losses, as well as its war construction, then when the Japanese come in and hit Pearl Harbor, then obviously the US Navy is starting off in a weak position in December 1941 to face off against Japan. Mark Bass says, can you talk about the Ottoman Navy? That's a fairly large subject. The Ottoman Empire was around for a long time, but in terms of the ironclad and dreadnought era Ottoman Navy, yeah, there's something coming down the line at some point about them. Not entirely sure when. Matthew Kidd says, the advantage of armoured flight decks must have been obvious halfway through the Essex Swarm being built. Was there any consideration into modifying any of the later Essexes to have armoured flight decks? No. When the Essexes were being designed, there was a consideration to actually build them with armoured flight decks from the get-go. Thank you very much, Paul Brunner. But when it comes to the Essexes, they made a hard and fast decision that they were going to build them with the hangar deck being the armoured section rather than the flight deck. There's many reasons, but basically air group size was one of the biggest ones. And to make... Basically, you can't build the Essex class the way that they are built and slap 3.5 inches of deck armour on the flight deck. It will make the thing hilariously top-heavy, and some parts of the structure aren't actually built to take that and support that level of weight either. So yeah, the only way you can build a carrier with an Essex type air group with an armoured flight deck is to build something that's almost a midway, basically. So, and obviously eventually they did. So yeah, they'd taken a decision and they weren't going to walk that back once they started building the Essexes. I mean, the other thing was that the Essex class was basically the culmination of US interwar carrier design. It wasn't a completely freehand design. It was basically, you can now build the carrier you want to without the restrictions of the treaty limits, but we also need that design very quickly. So it wasn't a kind of clean slate, right, we're doing everything from the keel up brand new, how would we build a carrier now? It was, we've built Wasp, Ranger, the Yorktowns, Hornet, of course, being a slightly modified version. Basically, how do we build a Yorktown, but the way we would have actually built it, if we didn't have the treaty restrictions? That's, crudely speaking, Essex. Where are we going? Right, okay. Let's do a few more questions. Tyler Kuhn, have you ever thought of doing another Spring Shop tutorial on destroyers and frigates, or do you know where I could find one for smaller warships? To be honest, if I was going to have something like that done, one, I know that Spring Shop is not quite as good at producing destroyers and frigates as it is at producing the larger ships. I'm not entirely sure why, but I do know it has some issues with that. But if I was going to do one of those, I'd probably ask one of the people who does a lot of spring sharp designs in the Discord to either basically hand-hold me through it or possibly do it themselves, and then I upload it, depending on what they prefer to do. Because, you know, I can design ships in spring sharp, but I'm not the sort of the master of spring sharp the way that I know some people in the dry dock Discord very much are. Code Monkey asks, in an alternate history, the USS California refit and Fuso stumble across each other in the South China Sea without friends. Who would win? Refit California, quite easily. Because by refit California, she's got radar, she's got all sorts of fancy upgrades that Fuso doesn't have. Fuso was refitted with her pagoda mast and everything quite a while before the Second World War, so she's not carrying radar, she's not carrying a lot of the more modern systems, and she's not as well protected either. So fire control advantage, protection advantage, etc., all goes California's way. The only thing that Fuso really has on California is that she's a fraction quicker, but that's not really going to help that much. Harold Gruntertjern says, have you considered a 5-minute guide for the Almirante Grau de Ruyter, since it's the last gun cruiser that was in service, since it started building in 39 but didn't enter service till 53? Yes, at some point. I've got some nice pictures of it as well. Yeah, that either has recently featured or will feature soonish, i.e. next year at some point. Adam 1066, wargaming in their description of Vanguard's main guns as absolutely obsolete main battery guns. Harsh or true? Definitely not true. The 15-inch 42 was an old gun, yes. It's not fully competitive with the absolute latest and greatest, but it's also not absolutely obsolete. The gun mountings as they originally existed, yes, would have been absolutely obsolete. But the gun mountings that went into Vanguard were very different from the gun mountings that they started off with. So they upgraded the elevation. They obviously had new shells. I mean, the guns of Warspite, etc., were all pretty competitive in World War II. And as I mentioned before, although Vanguard never carried them because it wasn't wartime, Vanguard was unique in that it had both the 30-degree maximum elevation upgrade from 20 degrees and it had the ability to fire superchargers, whereas in all the other Royal Navy capital ships, you either had your guns elevated to 30 degrees, like Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, Renown, etc., or, in the case of some of the older R-class, etc., you were given superchargers to give you extra range and punching power with a 20-degree maximum elevation. Vanguard had both. And with that, i.e. if she'd gone full wartime load on people, her range is more than adequate for, engaging people. And the penetration and hitting power of the 15-inch shell from the 15-inch 42 gun, as I say, is competitive. It's not absolute top tier the way that a Japanese 18.1 inch or an American 16-inch 50 is, but it's still solidly competitive and more than capable of dishing out the damage on almost anything it's ever going to run into. Megascrow. Oh, the list is longer than 5 years. I can guarantee you that much. Scooter JSP, did Germany ever try to adopt any of the Italians' optical range-finding systems? Not as far as I'm aware. The Italians' approach to having just so many optical rangefinders, it's both amusing and also, as I said, highly effective. The Germans didn't quite go in for that. The Italian optical rangefinding systems are a bit of a... I wouldn't say they're a compensation mechanism so much, because at the time that they're developed, everyone needs good optical ranging systems. But the Italians really took it to another level. Same with the Japanese. The Yamato's optical rangefinding systems were absolutely superb. It's just that by the time the Italians and the Japanese find themselves in an actual war, they're in a war where radars come along, and now you're having a good, as opposed to a superb, optical rangefinding system supplemented by radar is actually a superior solution. And the Germans, whose own radar efforts were a bit in advance of the Italians by World War II, were going very much more with that kind of integrated radar and optical solution. I mean, it's one of the things that people sometimes miss, in that by the end of the war, yes, the British and the Americans have incredibly advanced blind fire radar guidance and range-finding systems. The Germans aren't exactly that far behind. When you look at Tirpitz's final iteration of her fire control system, Tirpitz would have done a reasonably good job fighting at Surigao Strait if she'd been put in that situation. Granted, obviously, if she's an Axis ship, so if you put her in place of Fuso, she's fighting 6 versus 1, so she's definitely not going to win. But she, at least until explosives started tearing off all the radar antenna, she would have had a lot more combat awareness and capability to engage enemy shipping than the Japanese ships that were sent in ever did. Mark Bass, when and why did ships stop using torpedo nets around them strung from poles? Basically the 1910s. This is why when you look at sort of a number of ships, including Dreadnought, if you look at pictures of them in the 1900s, they've got the torpedo net booms up against the sides of the ships, and then you look at them at pictures in World War One, and certainly by the middle part of World War One, they no longer do. It's a few reasons. One, they're heavy, they add weight to the ship, it slows things down, it's not very useful. Two, they're a source of potentially of splinters and lots of stuff flying through the air, because these nets are mostly metal. So that's not good in a battle situation. And third, the idea that you could have the net strung around you whilst you were underway proved to be unworkable. They generated far too much drag. And fourth, they stopped working. Basically, the weight of net that you could meaningfully actually suspend off of a battleship, yes, it could stop torpedoes in 1900 or 1905, maybe, but by World War One, torpedoes had gotten faster, larger, nastier. Some of them even had net cutter tips on them. And so the weight of torpedo net that you could fit on a ship probably wouldn't have stopped a torpedo anyway. So at that point, why bother having them? Their torpedo nets themselves stayed in effect. They were still around in World War II in quite significant quantities, but they were much, much heavier, much beefier versions that you were never going to fit onto, stringing off the side of a ship in any reasonable way, shape or form. Oh, and chat's just catapulted. Tom asks, you go back in time to 1903 and show Jackie Fisher the specs for HMS Vanguard and the reasons why. How does Dreadnought change considering technology limitations? In terms of firepower and armour, probably not all that much. Her armour is good enough. He doesn't have a heavier gun available than the 12-inch. Then the 15-inch was, to be honest, was fairly rapidly developed anyway. Propulsion, well, he knows turbines are the future. That's something he'd already guessed. Probably the main thing that he's going to change about Dreadnought, looking at the specs for Vanguard, is he's going to probably go back to the drawing board and look at some of the designs that they had with super firing turrets, because if the specs and reasons for Vanguard, sorry, I'm just refilling the iron brew, include the reasons why super firing turrets are definitely a thing, well, you know, by having super firing turrets fore and aft, or even just a pair of super firing turrets forward, he can save a bunch of weight on Dreadnought by still getting an 8-gun broadside and then having, you know, 4 turrets instead of 5 in the 2 wing turrets. So he can potentially, I mean, given Fisher's obsession with speed, he'll probably use the saved displacement for more machinery and get Dreadnought to go even faster. So Dreadnought might even pop out at 23 knots or something like that. Obviously, it's not a 100% weight saving with the turret, because a super firing turret is going to need a barbette, so there's going to be maybe like 80-90% weight saving of one turret. But that's still several hundred tons, as well as potentially you could even narrow the ship slightly. Who knows? There's all sorts of things you can do with Dreadnought's hull and speed potential once you've eliminated the 5th turret. So I think that would be the main change to Dreadnought. Cody85 says, could you talk about the various naval airstrikes that happened during World War I? When did submarines start being an actual threat to shipping, and what was the most surprising thing you've learned so far? Okay, there's a bit of a summary one there. In the context of this, when did submarines start to be an actual threat to shipping? Pretty much around the time of World War I, or just immediately before was when people realised that submarines were useful for something more than just, you know, posturing around and defending harbours. They could actually then come off of the harbour, off of the coastline, and start engaging. That's one of the reasons why they ended up. That's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy, for example, abandoned the idea of close blockade. But they still didn't quite appreciate how much of a threat subs had become. Because you've got to remember, you know, 1900, submarines are pretty much coastal only. 1903, 1904, they still have a disturbing tendency to randomly catch fire and explode, because a lot of them are still petrol-powered. Diesel engines are introduced into submarines during the 1900s, and they advance very quickly from something that has maybe a torpedo and maybe a reload if you're lucky, to something that's carrying several torpedoes, to something that's carrying maybe a dozen torpedoes and multiple tubes, and can actually dive and travel long distance. So trying to draw a line of sort of what's the first class of sub that is a full-on threat, well, you know, a Royal Navy C-class submarine or an early German U-boat is a definite threat to any ship that gets too close to it, but they can't go too far to go and find them. Whereas the 1910, 1911 classes of German U-boat and the E-class submarine for the UK, for example, those can go and find enemy ships a lot further away. So it's a fuzzy line, but somewhere probably 1911, 1912, I would say that's when submarines start to become full-on threats to shipping wherever they might be. In terms of naval airstrikes that happened during World War I, there's quite a few, actually, but they tend to be rather small. So there's torpedo bomber strikes in the Black Sea against the Ottoman Navy, albeit that calling them torpedo bomber strikes is possibly pushing things a little bit. You've got a seaplane with a torpedo, but the approach is to see an enemy ship, land, taxi along the water, deploy your torpedo as if you're some kind of slightly ungainly, even more fragile torpedo boat, and then fly away. This actually works because, of course, there's no anti-aircraft armament, and it's fairly difficult to notice this kind of thing happening. But that's technically an airstrike. Then there's a bunch of air raids that are launched by the Royal Naval Air Service, as it is at the time, not the Fleet Air Arm, on various targets in Germany. So there's raids on the Zeppelin air sheds, which go reasonably well. A number of other similar kinds of airstrikes. There's a few attempted bombing attacks on ships, but that doesn't tend to work out so well because, let's face it, the kind of aircraft you can launch from a ship at this point, the bombs are basically a non-threat to anything larger than a destroyer. But yeah, so you've got the airship raids. But one of the interesting things is that with those kinds of raids, they are very much one-way tickets, and for the aircraft, not necessarily for the pilots, but they don't at this point have carriers that you can really land on. They've got a few carriers you can take off from, landing not so much. So they'll send the aircraft off, and then the idea is the aircraft will either divert to land-based airfields, or they'll come back to a prearranged rendezvous. They'll ditch, which is somewhat easier and safer to do when you're in a biplane that, you know, has a maximum speed of 120 miles an hour and a relatively pedestrian stall speed, and isn't made of metal, so it's not going to sink immediately. And then you get picked up and taken home. So the aircraft are as much expendable weapons as the bombs that they're carrying. But it is developing. The ideas are developing. Obviously, you've got things like the Ancona bombardment, where you have random seaplanes popping up to do bombardment as well, and a lot of seaplanes get involved in this kind of thing. Technically, some of the Zeppelin strikes on British soil are done by Kaiserliche Marine airships. So technically, that's naval airstrike, although I think that's probably pushing the envelope a bit. But in this context, the most surprising thing I learned about a few years ago was an air attack that didn't happen, but it didn't it's not that it didn't happen for lack of willingness. It didn't happen because the production of aircraft wasn't happening fast enough for the kind of scale of strike that was envisaged before the war ended. And this is something I need to do a full-on video about at some point, probably next year. And that's what would have been the single largest torpedo strike on a fleet in harbour in history. And yes, that's obviously bigger than Taranto, not that difficult, but also much bigger than Pearl Harbor, believe it or not, because as I pointed out a few weeks ago when I was doing various guest appearances talking about Pearl Harbor, the Japanese only actually sent in 40 torpedo bombers. They sent in more B-5Ns, but the majority of the B-5Ns that went in during the two strikes on Pearl Harbor were armed with bombs, not torpedoes. There were only 40 torpedo-carrying B-5Ns, and they were in the first wave. But the Royal Navy plan was to use a new torpedo bomber in 1918 called the Sopwith Cuckoo, and they wanted to launch no less than 120 of the things. So they wanted to show up off the German coast because they were fed up with the high seas fleet not coming and dying gloriously. And the plan was to launch 120 Cuckoos, all loaded up with torpedoes, and to show up over Wilhelmshaven en masse and just start torpedoing everything left, right, and centre. Thus making it, the largest torpedo strike on an enemy fleet in harbour by a factor of about 3. They originally wanted to do this in autumn 1918, but Sopwith Cuckoo production hadn't come up with enough aircraft for them to do their 120 torpedo bomber strike, and so they decided to put it off till spring because the weather in the intervening time was not going to be good enough. And if the war had continued into spring 1919, they would have launched it, which would have been, whether it would have worked, it's such an off-the-wall thing compared to the conventional line of military history. Who knows? Again, someone would have to do a lot of evaluation of what, if any, major air defences did Wilhelmshaven have, what is the exact performance and airdrop characteristics of a Sopwith Cuckoo, What kind of training would they have gotten? Would they even have found the target? I mean, bear in mind this is World War One. There is a small possibility of the weather intervening and the raid not finding anything, and some surprise German field getting visited by swarms of torpedoes being dropped so the aircraft can go home. So yeah. Bert Lattimore, at Trafalgar, Nelson allowed the Franco-Spanish fleet to cross his T, yet not only did the British survive, they broke the French line and won decisively. How did that happen? Basically, Nelson was betting on the reduced capabilities of the Franco-Spanish fleet that he'd obviously spent a good portion of his life fighting. So he knew that the British had a rate of fire advantage. He knew, therefore, that the Franco-Spanish fleet would not be firing anywhere near as far or as fast as, or as accurately as his own ships. And he also could see how the Franco-Spanish fleet was a little bit broken up. So, getting your T crossed, getting your bows raked, is pretty much the nightmare scenario for the vast majority of Age of Sail conflicts. But it also relies on either having your bow crossed for raking fire at very close range, where you can just pour massive amounts of fire in, or if it's a longer distance engagement, you get receiving repeated accurate volleys in order to cripple you before you can get close enough to do anything in return. And Nelson basically counted on the Franco-Spanish fleet opening fire almost as soon as they were in range, so there wouldn't be any double or triple shotted broadsides at point blank, breaking his ships, and as I say, that the rate of fire would be slow enough and inaccurate enough that they wouldn't be able to accumulate enough damage on his ships to stop him. As I'm going to cover in the Trafalgar video, Nelson Part 3, which is coming to a screen near you in probably spring next year, it was still a very close run thing. Very, very close. I won't say more than that because that's spoilers for the video itself. But I suppose there you go. Nelson Part 3 coming probably March, April, something like that, depending on how editing goes. Paul Bruner asks, as a very fanciful scenario, if Japan had backed down in the 30s and as a result of the trade embargo and not bombed the US in 1941, so there's no Pacific War, would the battleship have become obsolete? I mean, eventually, yes. Because things like the Fritz X would have pointed out that, a single aircraft, if not properly deterred and held off, could end a battleship. So eventually so. But the perception of the battleship being knocked back probably would have been held off for a few years. And they may well, and I suppose even then people may then also still have the argument of, well, okay, so a large bomber carrying a very large manually directed weapon can kill a battleship, but a battleship with good AA and fighter cover, etc., should be able to, survive that by preventing that very precise plan drop from happening. But as weapons become more self-guided, aircraft become faster and higher flying, etc., the battleship's still going to be facing major problems about its viability as the frontline combatant by the late 40s at the very latest. GM MEF1STO asks, assuming that the US doesn't nuke Prince Eugen and Nagato, is there any chance that they become museum ships? Possibly, but I wouldn't necessarily bet on it. The main reason for that is that, well, the reason why there's so many US ships, battleships, cruisers, etc., preserved is either, in the case of some of the smaller ships, they were in service for quite a while. In the case of some of the larger ships, well, obviously the Iowas were in and out of service, but some of the larger ships, they were in the reserve fleet long enough that by the time it came up to dispose of them, they'd become old enough for people to have a vested interest in keeping them around as museum ships. Whereas if you look at a lot of the ships that went to the scrapyard a lot sooner because they were older and more worn out, they didn't become museum ships. And with Prince Eugen and Nagato, they're not going to go into US service. They've already been thoroughly analysed. There's not a tremendously compelling reason by the end of the 1940s to keep them around. Because, as I say, you're not going to put them in a reserve fleet to reactivate them. You'd basically have to have someone deciding that they were going to become prizes, museums, memorials, or something like that in the very early 1950s, if you were going to preserve them. I think if they'd been given back to Germany and Japan respectively, then quite possibly they might have been preserved as museum vessels. More so in Japan, perhaps, than in Germany. But even then, it would be chancy. It's basically a rule of thumb with museum ships that unless they're absolutely 100% notable in a big, big way, to the extent that politicians absolutely can't ignore it, the only way a ship ends up being a museum ship is it first has to survive at least 3 or 4 decades past its retirement date, which is usually quite a difficult feat. Thank you very much, Miles McCaskill. Blackjack, what was the major mistake that made by the French that led them to fall to the status of a second-rate naval power? See, now this is an interesting one, because in the ironclad era, which is really when they start that fall, France has a number of technological advances. I mean, they're the ones who start the ironclad race. They come up with a number of other advances during that sort of 2-3 decade period. They're the leaders in steel technology in the 1870s, certainly, and probably going into the 1880s as well. They have full working electric turrets when the British are still electrocuting themselves, trying to make it work in the 1900s. I would say there's 3 major mistakes that the French make that make them fall back. And that's outside of the fact, as a land-based European power, they end up having to maintain a very large army. You have the Franco-Prussian War as well, which really doesn't help matters, but that's not a mistake by the French Navy. You could argue getting into the Franco-Prussian War is a mistake by France, but that's another matter. But in terms of directly or first-order naval issues, I would say the first mistake was the Jeune École, because with the Jeune École, they went through a period where they weren't designing any major capital ships, and when you look at the similar period for Britain and almost everybody else, that's the period when ships start to grow in size quite considerably, and thus people are both upgrading their infrastructure and looking for the future, building more infrastructure. And the French kind of miss out on a lot of that. So when it comes around to them starting to pick up battleship building again, not only is there something of a break in their design experience, but they're now left with a capital ship construction infrastructure that's several decades behind everybody else's, and they're constantly playing catch up pretty much from then until battleships stop being a thing. When you're talking about, say, the British building something like Hood, the British are looking at it going, okay, well, we can build a ship like Hood. We can only build it on a few slipways, and we can only maintain it in a few dockyards, but we can do it. The French, at the same time, physically can't. That's why the Normandies and the Lyons are so small relative to competitor designs from the period. And you go into the Second World War, they're still stuck in this same thing of their infrastructure is just that little bit behind. So, the British are building the King George V, they're thinking about building the Lions, and they do build Vanguard. The Americans are building the Iowas, and the French are looking at, Richelieu and going, that's actually a fraction too big for our shipyards. And so for building the Alsace, one of the major problems is, which shipyards are we going to have to upgrade for a third time? Because they had to upgrade some yards for the Dunkirks, they had to upgrade other yards for the Richelieus, and now they're having to upgrade their yards again for the Alsace. So that kind of break in infrastructure, upgrades, etc., that was a huge problem for them later on. The other big issue that I think really did a number on them was the fact that they allowed most of their capital ship construction to be done by incredibly diverse private firms with huge personal interests. So instead of getting standard classes, one of the major problems with a lot of the early and mid-level French pre-dreadnoughts is that whilst they might notionally be part of the same class, they're effectively all subclasses of one, because they have so many design differences, because different shipyards want to do things their own way, which is a huge, huge problem. It means the ships being produced are slower, it means slower to produce, they are not compatible with each other entirely, the logistics and maintenance requirements are absolutely massive and expensive. It really does a number on them. And again, it leaves them trying to catch up. And I think that those are probably the two biggest issues that they have. Plus, as I say, the fact that, they're looking more and more at maintaining what they've got rather than trying to challenge anyone by that point. Broken Wolf 668. In the Christmas spirit, how much vodka was consumed during a Hotnick's design process? It's the famous war canoe, and what were they going for? It's fundamentally with coming up with that design. The basic problem they've got is we want lots of torpedoes on a destroyer, and they're designing it in a period where the idea of triple, quadruple, quintuple launchers really isn't a thing yet. So if you want to have lots and lots of torpedo launchers, although, triple and quadruple torpedo launchers aren't that far off, but at the time, it's like if you want a lot of torpedo launchers, you just need lots of twins at that point. And if you want them to all be able to fire on the broadside, well, it's the same thing with the guns as well. You've got this devotion, well, not devotion, but the early restrictions of having twins, maybe triples, rather than quads and quintuples for torpedo launchers, and with destroyer guns, single mounts rather than the twin mounts that you see late in the later part of the interwar period. So if you want a ship with lots of torpedo capability and lots of gun capability, and you want it to be a destroyer, which means a long, thin hull form, you just need to make it longer. Tevildo asks, any recommendations for a film to watch this evening, ideally naval themed? Well, if you're going to ask me for any naval themed film, then I am going to suggest Master and Commander. And although, with that said, if you want to watch another naval film or another naval related film tonight, then feel free to do so, because of course you can, as with a number of other films, play a neat little trick on next Friday the 31st, and someone sent me a link to exactly what time it is, but basically if you start watching Master and Commander at a certain time before midnight, then you ring in the new year with Jack Aubrey shouting "Let fly." So that's always a fun trick. And you can do the same thing, obviously, with Two Towers, the second Lord of the Rings film. You can ring in the new year with "And so it begins," if you time it all right. Meijin Warmbogen 12, what do you think there are more of in the ocean starting 1901 to 1960? Cannon shells, any caliber, or 20 to 40 millimeter rounds? 20 to 40 millimeter rounds, because tens of thousands of those things were shot off into the air, and most of them never hit anything. Whereas, yeah, anything larger than that would have been fired in much, much smaller quantities. Ramal, which battleship class in World War II has the best secondary guns in terms of firepower and accuracy? Those are two very different questions, because in terms of absolute firepower, you're probably looking either at something like a Littorio or an original Flavor Yamato, because they have 6.6-inch turrets. But whether the fire can, this is the thing, it's like that gives you the heaviest firepower for anti-surface engagements, but both of those are not really capable of anti-aircraft use. So best secondary gun in terms of anti-aircraft use, as well as my anti-aircraft gun video showed, the best one hands down is the 5-inch 38, followed by the 4.5 and the 5.25. So any US ship that has the standard 5.25-inch guns in 10 twin mounts has the best secondary in terms of overall firepower. And then accuracy, it's down to, well, which one of those ships has the most accurate gun crews, the best fire control systems. Probably, in terms of the gun crews, probably USS Washington. In terms of fire control systems, probably one of the Iowas. TXR WAUY, I'm not even going to pretend to know how to pronounce that, says, particularly enjoyed your design for HMS Thunderchild. Well, you'll be glad to know there is a 3D model of Thunderchild that I now have, so I'll be showing that off at some point next year as well. Will we see a Battle of Surigao Strait or attack on Taranto video? Yes, definitely. Surigao Strait definitely at some point. Well, Taranto, yes, also definitely at some point. But Surigao Strait, the only thing that is stopping me from doing that is finding a slot to put it in. Whereas I have some particular plans for what I would like to do for a Taranto video that require me to go out and film things. GeoGuy 001 says, if World War II in Europe was delayed, would the British have built additional Vanguard-class fast battleships? I saw a reference in Garsky and Doolin about this. Yes, that was the Admiralty's plan. As I mentioned in the video I did about what the Royal Navy would have done if somehow the Germans had magicked up Plan Z, the British had invested quite considerably in the late 1930s in their armour production industry, so they could by 1939, 1940 produce a lot more battleship armour than they could in the mid-1930s, when they were having to import large amounts of armour from what at the time was Czechoslovakia to make up for shortfalls. And they had the slipways, obviously, so they could build the battleship hulls, they could build the machinery, they could build the armour. The one thing they couldn't build fast enough to equip lots more battleships was guns. So the plan was to build an additional Vanguard class or Vanguard type every year, using guns, because they were planning, because the thing is, initially the King George V's had been planned to replace the R-class. Because of the rising tensions, they decided to keep the R-class while the King George V's were being brought into service, and then the R-class would have started to be decommissioned as the last King George V's and the first Lions came into service. So the idea then would have been to basically take the guns straight off the R's, recondition them, and put them on Vanguards. Sean Riley, any World of Warships Fun Fridays? Maybe. The thing is, I don't want the Fun Fridays. The whole point of those was to be occasional things when I had stuff that went beyond the scope of the 5-minute guides, the dry dock, and the Wednesday videos to bring you. I definitely don't want the Fun Fridays to become a regular fixture, because quite frankly, I'm just not up to producing 4 videos a week. So yeah, there will be further Fun Fridays to come. I've got a bit more Dystopian War stuff to come. I've got Victory at Sea stuff to come. I've got Black Sail stuff to come. So that's all tabletop wargaming. And as I mentioned in the dry dock, if people want, I've also got HEMA stuff, reenactment stuff, airsoft stuff. All these are various fun things that I do. That I think, well, some people might be interested in, but fall into the category of a Fun Friday, i.e. it's not the primary content, and I don't ever want all of that collectively to detract from the main content. So I'm never going to do a, hey guys, watch me charge around an airsoft site for an hour instead of a Wednesday video. You will always have that regular stream of naval content. It's just at some point, if enough people want it, I might put up a Fun Friday in addition to the regular Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday videos, which involves me charging around becoming Corporal L.R. Jenkins Esquire, as I usually get shot mercilessly by people who are very accurate and or have saws. Kieran asks, after the loss of HMS Victoria, were there any flooding lessons learned? Yes, quite a lot. Quite a lot of lessons came out of HMS Victoria: where to put bulkheads, how to make sure they were sealed, how to make sure the bulkhead walls weren't pierced by unnecessary things, what kind of sort of closed up status ships should have whilst they're undergoing manoeuvres or they're in action. At some point when I get round to doing the video on the loss of HMS Victoria, there's probably going to be about 10-15 minutes where I just go over Admiralty reports with a long list of recommendations about what to do in the future when it's possible that ships might end up, facing significant flooding issues. JC Homeslice, yes, I did answer that question before. I do plan on making more videos about carrier naval aircraft. I will be making one about the Swordfish, again, probably spring. And then a bunch of additional stuff about other naval aircraft when I can find experts to talk to about them. Jake Miller, if you could swap Enterprise for another preserved carrier, which would you, and which one would you get rid of? That's a loaded question, because there's going to be people who love each and every preserved aircraft carrier and are going to get up in arms about me scrapping one of them in favour of Enterprise. But hand on heart, you've got Yorktown, Hornet, and Lexington, all Essexes, obviously, preserved. You've got Midway preserved, and you've got Intrepid preserved at the very least. Of all of those, Midway is one-off. It's not one-off as it was built, but it's a unique one. So don't get rid of Midway. You've then got 4 Essexes. Hornet has history with the space program as well as World War II, so keep her. Yorktown and Lexington both carry famous names. Carriers obviously sunk earlier in the war, so I'd keep those. So if I was going to ditch any single preserved carrier in the US in favour of Enterprise, by process of elimination, it pretty much has to be Intrepid. TXR WAUI, Command at Sea and Harpoon are great naval war games. If someone wants a classic long video, watch Das Boot or Tora Tora Tora. Yeah, Das Boot is quite good. Tora Tora Tora, if you can find it. I don't know where it's available. Matt Clem, any plans to do a video on the Hog Island shipyards? As and when I can get round to them. I mean, I've got probably 3 or 4 videos on Jersey, as in the British Channel Island, to do. There's a surprising amount of naval history going on there. And I've also got a bunch of stuff from Chatham Dockyard to do as well. And for those of you who may be aware that obviously I went to those places this year and why I haven't done the videos on them thus far, the thing is, when it comes to places like Chatham Dockyard or Jersey, etc., you know, those places went a fair bit out of their way to accommodate me. So with Chatham, they let me in to do a bunch of recording and have access to their ships when it was shut during the latter stages of lockdown. It was obviously very safe because, you know, it's very easy to socially distance when there's half a dozen of you on a several dozen acre site. So that's perfectly fine. But, you know, they didn't have to do that. And they were very kind about doing that. And the same thing with Jersey. Subscriber, I won't name for privacy reasons, was very kind enough to invite me down, to sort things out, to sort out a schedule, and basically be my tour guide to all sorts of places around the island. And the islanders themselves, the people who ran the museums, etc., were very hospitable. I got plenty of footage, learned an awful lot as well. And so I want to make sure that what I can provide for them in terms of, you know, raising people's awareness that these places exist on the channel, I want that to have the maximum possible effect. And, you know, if I published a video on, say, Chatham Dockyards in October, November, well, great, that would have meant that people would have had 6-8 weeks maybe of dull British winter to go and see a primarily outdoor site in, you know, growing hours of darkness. That's not really that pleasant. Not many people would do it. And the same thing with Jersey, you know, travel restrictions, etc., obviously because of COVID, and again also deteriorating weather and daylight conditions. I could have put videos up about them during the autumn and winter. It would have been fine for me. But how many people would have remembered, oh yeah, that might be a nice place to go and visit 6-8 months down the line? Not many. So when I get videos from places like that, you know, even if only half a dozen people or so decide, actually, well, I'm going to go and have a look and poke around there because that looked pretty cool, that's still half a dozen more than would have otherwise done it, which means net benefit for the people who kindly put themselves out to help me out. And so I'm holding on to that footage so that when I release that footage, I say hopefully in the spring, then those places will benefit the most from what they were able to do to help me. And the same thing actually with the Golden Hind. I've got a massive, probably hour 15, hour and a half script about Drake's voyage around the world, and footage I shot on the Golden Hind replica in London. Again, they were in the middle of refitting the ship this year. It's winter at the moment, so release that in maybe June, July next year, summer holidays, nice and warm. Hopefully the restrictions to visiting it won't be too bad. It'll be fully open by then, hopefully, so they'll get the most benefit from what they were able to do for me. So hopefully you can kind of see the logic there when it comes to when and how I do some of these videos. USS Grey Ghost. If Vanguard is built with quad 14-inch guns, with 4 quad 14s, how is she versus Yamato, Tirpitz and Roma 1v1 for each? Well, basically you're talking about the Marlborough in World of Warships. I mean, against Tirpitz, she's got double the number of guns and Vanguard's fire control and armour, so that's a reasonable, pretty good, decent advantage. And the same versus Roma. The 14-inch gun is a decent enough gun, and the sheer numbers of having 16 guns on Vanguard's speed, fire control and armour, she'd have a fair good advantage over either Tirpitz or Roma. Against Yamato, that's something of another matter. Sheer number of guns is great. She can fire staggered 8-gun salvos, but Yamato's still armed with 18.1-inch guns. So against Yamato, it'd be a coin toss of, can that many shells break something on Yamato quickly enough that Yamato can't fire back and hit her much, if at all. The armoured officer. What's the maximum amount of armour ever considered on a battleship? In terms of absolute thickness, 24 inches was the thickest ever installed on a battleship, albeit it was iron. In terms of maximum amount of armour ever considered on a battleship, in terms of effective thickness, i.e. resistance to incoming fire, you therefore have to come through to the Krupp steel era. And at that point, there were considerations for battleships with 18 or even 20-inch armour belts, at least in sketch form, in the 1920s and then in the mid to late 1940s. Although, to be honest, by the mid to late 1940s, most of the armour schemes were now looking at deck armour more than anything else. So one of the 1945 battleship designs that was sketched up in Britain called for a ship 1,000 foot long, but it had 12 inches of deck armour, and they actually thinned the belt armour down to basically only being proof against cruiser grade gunfire, because that's what you needed to do to have a foot thick of deck armour in order to withstand all the projected bombs and missiles, etc. Right. Sorry, I'm beginning to lose my voice a little bit, which is a little annoying because we've only been doing this for 2 hours 10 minutes. But as I said, it's been a long day. TST CCNT, is this a Starship Enterprise disc section popping up from the last of the top bookshelves? No, that is a Nebula class starship. I'm going to rotate them through, so there'll be a different starship sitting there next to Stabby the string bag next week when we do the Discord, the Patreon live stream. Walter Gabarzik. Sorry, I'm horribly mangled your name. Florida fan, now freezing in the UK. Well, I do apologise for that. It's single digits Celsius here at the moment. Although with that said, if you happen to be in London or Portsmouth at any point in the next couple of weeks, and there's on a day when the attractions are actually open, Belfast Dockyard, etc. Feel free to give me a shout, and if the days line up, I might be able to come and give you a guided tour. I've not been able to do that yet for people who have wound up in the UK and been in the vicinity, but I'm not say always happy to, because sometimes I do have other things to do. But if you do happen to be a subscriber and you happen to find yourself near Portsmouth or London and you want to go around one of the museum ships, then feel free to drop me a line, and if I am available, I will happily take a few hours out of my day to show you some things you might not otherwise have realised. Scooter JSP, if Operation Sea Lion was to have any chance of succeeding, what is the latest that preparations would have had to be started, and what would have been the UK's response when they noticed? In terms of the immediate campaign in 1940 and 1941, the latest I think that they could do was September, because past that you wouldn't be prepared in time before the autumn and winter storms blew up, and it would be impossible for the kind of landing craft the Germans had. In sort of the longer term arc of could they have made it work in any way, shape or form at all? Looking at how long it took the British and the Americans to conceive of, test, design and then build sufficient decent landing craft, even completely ignoring the naval supremacy question, you're probably looking at having to start preparations at least 3 years earlier in order to have the numbers and correct types of landing craft to pull off that kind of operation. Joseph Askins asks, are there any plans to do an in-depth design and damage history of ships like the Yorktowns as well as other battleships and carriers? Possibly, eventually. I mean, yeah, eventually, over time, something like that is something that will make a decent Wednesday video. But full spectrum design and damage histories of classes... I mean, I know I did it with Queen Elizabeth's, but I'd say, yes, it's something I would certainly do, but it's not on my priority list of Wednesday videos in the immediate future. There's a lot of other stuff I'd like to get done first. Jeffrey Nagy, what if HMS Incomparable was built? Would it start another naval arms race? Probably not, because if she was built, I can foresee either the Washington Naval Treaty demanding that she be scrapped, or, given that she was fairly lightly armoured, the other thing, which actually harks back to a question I saw someone ask much earlier in the chat, is that she probably would have ended up being converted into an aircraft carrier. Because, yeah, basically along the similar lines of Lexington and Saratoga, which would have been an absolutely fascinating thing, because Incomparable was huge. She was 1,000 feet long. So once you've stuck a flight deck on her... myself and Dr. Clark had a very long conversation about this when we were down at the Fleet Aero Museum in Yeovilton earlier this year. And we basically came to the conclusion that if you make a carrier out of Incomparable, you end up with a ship that is so large that she's going to end up with the same kind of problems that some of the Essexes and the Midways had in the latter part of World War II, which is that, in theory, she can carry well above 100 aircraft. But it's almost impossible with the technology of the time to actually properly operate an air group that size. At which point, you know, you either have this massive carrier with little isolated pockets of aircraft of a sustainable air group size, probably in 80, 90 strong or so, scattered about the ship looking very forlorn, and probably some form of internal transport system to get to and from them. Or you end up in the slightly odd scenario of Incomparable actually being physically large enough and needing to fill the space such that, whilst fighters will still remain single-engined aircraft, it's entirely possible that Incomparable might pioneer the use of twin-engined strike aircraft, torpedo bombers, probably not dive bombers, but certainly torpedo bombers, to give increased range, carrying capacity, etc., etc. Because the twin-engine aircraft, whilst Eric Winkle Brown was able to prove that you could land a Sea Mosquito on a late war British armoured aircraft carrier, it was a bit of a close run thing. Whereas if you've got a ship with a 1,000+ foot long flight deck and a hangar the size of what you could fit in Incomparable, landing a twin-engine aircraft on it is going to be a doddle, comparatively speaking. So with the capacity on board, you could, as I say, you could very well see, you can have 80 to 90 aircraft on board, but maybe 3 or 4 squadrons of them will be fighters, and then the other squadrons will be twin-engine strike aircraft, which could revolutionize carrier design, because if you've got this one ship that's got these incredibly powerful and capable strike aircraft as compared to everybody else's single engine designs. Well, the treaty limits on what hull size, what displacement, etc. you get out of carriers might very well be changed, if not at the Washington Treaty, but then by the time everyone's cottoned on, at least by the London Treaty. Yeah. The Armoured Officer, can a modern MBT... Yeah. I was just reading that question and everything went sideways. Where the heck has that gone? This is the risk of hovering on a single comment somewhere. Oh my word. Right. Sorry, the chat just jumped absolutely massively. I'm trying to find out where that went, where that question went, if it did at all. If I haven't found it in the next 10-15 seconds, I'm just going to have to pick another one. Iron Darkness says, show us the Custodes. Yeah, my Adeptus Custodes army is upstairs, unfortunately, and, well, this camera is wired. So, again, maybe a thing for a fun Friday or something. Ramal, how much enthusiasm do you have for airsoft? Do you have airsoft guns? Yes, many. Mrs. Drac says, far too many in some cases. I liked having choices. Put it that way. I like playing airsoft. It's more realistic than paintball. It actually leaves you with fewer long-term injuries than paintball, and yeah, it's fun. I find it fun. The main thing is, as with all games, you have to remember, don't take it too seriously. As one of the staff is fond of pointing out, we're a bunch of overgrown children who've, we've paid an awful lot of money to dress up in camouflage and get shot. So you can't take yourself too seriously at that point. Graham Kidd, no, paintball hasn't been banned. I just don't like it as much. It also has, as I said, it actually has far more. You get far more injuries in paintball than you ever get in airsoft, in my experience. Fairly nasty ones as well. Ian Winter says, got 3D models for victory at sea of the cancelled battleships and battlecruisers of the Washington Treaty. Really? As in, you have them, or they're releasing them? Because I haven't seen that they're releasing them, but I'd be very interested in them if they did. Graham Dempsey asks, would you and the Bill Trumps crew do a special on CVA 01 of what ifs that will give Jamie nightmares? We'd have to be very, very kind to Jamie, but I'm sure at some point we can cover CVA 01, probably in the context of, what fleet, what Navy should have versus what politicians will let them have. Chazix asks, 4 HMS Thunderchild versus 4 Charlemagne pre-dreadnoughts. That's a good question, actually. I mean, the Charlemagnes have more firepower. The Thunderchilds have a bit more forward punch. It'd be a very even match, I think. If they're 4 of my Thunderchilds versus 4 Charlemagnes. The Charlemagnes certainly have the capacity to shoot them to pieces if they get the hits in, but then given that we are talking about pre-dreadnought levels of gunnery accuracy, it's entirely possible a charge by 4 Thunderchilds might actually get close enough in to either use torpedoes or rams to make it an overall Thunderchild victory. Mason Stewart says, I'm writing a script, it's professional, on the Battle of the Atlantic. Not trying to brag or ask for help, just wanted to share. It's only because of this channel I got into that side of history. Awesome. Well, you see, this is the thing. This is the channel in action. You know, this is what I want. This is the kind of thing I want to happen. You know, the whole purpose of the channel is to develop people's enthusiasm for naval history. So if, you know, people have started channels because they've seen what I've done, and have started channels either covering modern naval subjects or other subjects, cars, etc., that they have a lot of knowledge on, which is fantastic because now that means I have places to learn about other stuff that I don't know all that much about. Yeah, and if you manage to get yourself a job writing a professional script on the Battle of the Atlantic because you got interested in naval history through the channel, excellent. That's exactly the kind of thing the channel's supposed to do, because as I've reflected with some naval historians when I've been chatting to them, you know, there is no one ultimate truth when it comes to naval history. Otherwise there would just be the big book of naval history and we'd all just be parroting out of that. There's loads of stuff to know, there's loads of stuff to research, there's loads of stuff to find out, there's loads of fields in which you can become an expert. I mean, you know, you can list off the equipment of a battleship. Okay, you know, secondary guns, primary guns, tertiary guns if necessary, or light anti-aircraft guns possibly. Then you've got the fire control systems, the radar, the engines, the armour, etc. You could quite easily spend your entire life becoming a specialist in any single one of those fields. I mean, there's a shelf upstairs on the upstairs library section of the house, which, you know, the entire shelf is just books on World War I electronic warfare and radar equipment. And there's about 3-4 foot of books, and that's obviously not all the stuff that's been written about it, and that's just the radar, let alone everything else. So yeah, great, fantastic. The more people involved in naval history, the better, because it means more interesting stuff can be found. Knight 6831, out of the 2 refit plans for Hood, which was the most likely and why? I think the one that I reflected on when I did my What If Hood Had Survived video, where the entire side belt armour is rationalized to a single larger 12-inch belt and some of the extraneous stuff is removed, which is it's the slightly more ambitious one. But as I pointed out in the video, that even when the Royal Navy was looking at it in sketch, that option and all the other changes it offered gave you a far more capable ship for a, relatively speaking, very small increase in price compared to the first option. And it wasn't going to take that much longer either. So it's basically a case of you spent a fraction more time, a fraction more money, and you get an infinitely more capable ship out of it. And the Royal Navy had kind of realised this already. They didn't like the original, the budget option. But it was kind of the absolute minimum that they would accept. Jane Cobb's hat, will USS Oglala ever get her own guy? Sure. I mean, she got mentioned enough in my Pearl Harbor salvage videos, I could probably just crib the material from that, but I won't. I mean, I'll take some of it, but she did other stuff other than, you know, be a somewhat unfortunate victim of Pearl Harbor. TXWAU, why did I see a model Star Fury from B5 in one of your interviews? Yes, it's up there. I think it's hiding behind the nebula at the moment. Daniel Moore, how much does armor versus penetration capacity differ from the game of World of Warships to real life? It's a bit of a long and involved topic, but basically the single biggest issue I have with World of Warships is that they artificially shortened the range, which is fine because it's a game. You don't necessarily want to be... Well, you're not going to get massive numbers of people who want to fight a realistic naval battle. I mean, with realistic ranges. So if you fight in, say, Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, that gives you something of more of an idea of what a realistic naval battle is going to be in terms of range, you know, where the enemy is a speck on your screen on the horizon and the only thing you really see of them is the shells as they come in and land somewhat near you. Now, I admit, yeah, people aren't necessarily going to want to play a game that's all that all the time. So they have to shorten the ranges to make it a little bit more attractive. But they kept the armor penetration calculations, which, to be fair, are not bad. There's still some artificiality going on there, but you get things like bow tanking with 32mm plate and things like that. But anyway... in general, the armor penetration calculations going on aren't too bad, except for the fact they're still scaled to the actual ranges in question. So, you know, you end up fighting at what your guns in the game say is your maximum range. In actual fact, would be half or less than what your actual range is. But instead of your shells having the penetration they would do at the maximum range of your ship in real life, they have the penetration of what that they would have at 12 to 14,000 yards, which means that ships with lots of guns, or very hard-hitting guns, i.e. ships that prioritise firepower over everything else, tend to have an advantage which is somewhat unrealistic compared to real life, whereas ships that maybe sacrificed some other things to put displacement into armor don't actually do quite as well in the game because they're effectively everyone's fighting at knife fighting range, so the armor is kind of pointless at that point. Sage of Irrelevance says, how would events change if the 8th R-class HMS Resistance had been reordered as a renowned class battlecruiser instead of being cancelled? Well, it's not going to change World War I all that much because she would have been launched right at the end of it. But it would mean some interesting things for the Washington Treaty because, well, the British now have 4 battlecruisers, which in and of itself is not necessarily a game ender. The bigger problem is that when the Royal Navy is looking around, what ships is it going to scrap? Now it has much more problems because, I mean, initially keeping the Iron Dukes and the King George V's around, not so much of a problem. You probably still get the Nelsons anyway, but when you come to the latter part of the 1930s, when Tiger and the Iron Dukes finally go by the wayside, and the Royal Navy now has an entirely 15-inch fleet except for the Nelsons. What extra 15-inch ship is or more is going to be scrapped in exchange for keeping Resistance, which they probably will want to do. Probably one of the R's, in which case, you know, I'd argue Resistance will probably be more useful in World War II than a random R-class. But perhaps in the late 20s, early 30s, that might be a bit more of a difficult decision for the Royal Navy to make. Paul is plain asking, have you ever read David Webber? My mother is a fan of the Honorverse series, and I'm a fan of the Informs books called Out of the Dark and Into the Light series. I haven't. People keep saying I should, but unfortunately I haven't. I've never actually gotten around to reading that book series. I know a little bit about it from online chats and stuff like that, but Yeah, nothing much beyond that. Um, that's where that question went. Mega Scrow, would you do a virtual guided tour where you lead a 360-degree camera around? I personally would love to do that, but if I'm going to do a virtual guided tour with a 360 camera, that would have to be arranged probably as part of something official being done with whatever museum ship I was doing it with in question. Because the thing is, if I give somebody a tour around the ship, that's a net benefit to the ship, because the person was going anyway. Then I go, so I'm paying an additional ticket price, so they've got one extra ticket in there, which is good for them. And who knows, a few other people might pick up something interesting from listening to me, wandering around. So yeah, it's a win-win for them as far as they're concerned. Whereas if I do my own virtual guided tour with various bits of camera equipment, or one, various GDPR data protection laws is going to, with 360 cameras, going to make it very difficult, because if I go there during normal times, obviously there's going to be people getting caught there and lots of editing to do. But regardless of that, if I then release a virtual guided tour, even if I release it absolutely for free, people are now going to be watching that and going on that tour as opposed to going on the ship, which is then a loss, because then if they're not getting the visitors. So unless one of the museum ships approached me and specifically said, we would like to do this with you and host it on our site, which I'd be perfectly fine with, then I'd do it. But otherwise, no, I wouldn't, because part of naval history is trying to ensure that as many museum ships as possible are preserved. So giving away all the secrets, that's not really kind to them. Mike Magnuson, when do you foresee your next trip across the pond? So again, hoping everything goes okay with the current situation with Omicron and all that, I'm hoping to be in the US for 3 weeks in this coming April. Beyond that, there are a lot more ships I need to visit. There's obviously Haida and Sackville up in Canada. There's a whole bunch of other ships people pointed out to me in the States. And of course, Pearl Harbor itself. Whether I do that later this year, maybe August, September, or whether I do it in later next year in August, September, or whether I do it in 2023, I don't know. But I definitely do have plans for a second US tour if it turns out to be possible. But right now, I'm just hoping I get this first one locked in, as opposed to having the whole thing cancelled on me again. Especially since I'm bringing Mrs. Drack and a support crew with me this time, rather than running myself ragged on a 2-week hyperspeed schedule, which, I mean, one, it means I'll probably survive without having to, kill myself with Red Bull or something. But at the same time, it also means that with 4 people's worth of arrangements to sort out, there's a lot more money on the line for this trip. Yeah, I mean, when everything got cancelled last time, I was out of pocket a bit, thanks to a lot of US hotels and airlines having the attitude of, "Oh, you're cancelling. Oh, yes, there's a global pandemic and our government has banned all travel to the country. We don't actually care. And also, you're lucky we're not charging you further money in terms of cancellation fees. Please go away." So basically, the only money I got back from the cancelled trip last time was my transatlantic flight tickets, which, to be fair, were the bulk of the expense I put into it at that point. And a pointless ESTA visa, which hilariously ran out last month. But yeah, if everything gets locked down again this April, I'm going to be very, very annoyed. Ian Winter, when the US Navy started to use the escort carriers, why did they not use Ranger at that point? Because the escort carriers could be in more than one place. Ranger couldn't. And also Ranger actually was having quite a fun time being first a big aircraft ferry along with Furious in the Western Mediterranean, and then also being the centerpiece of Operation Torch in terms of air support. So Ranger had her uses. She definitely wasn't a frontline fleet carrier, but she did have her uses that were, they needed her carrying capacity a lot more than escorting a single convoy did. She was also up in the North Sea for a while as well. But yeah, the escort carriers, they provided enough of an air cover, and as I say, there were a lot more of them. Ranger could cover a convoy and would be a significantly greater loss when she was sunk, whereas the escort carriers, A, could cover multiple convoys, and B, if you lost one, it wasn't too much of an issue. Jack 3000 says, I'm near the Harwich docks. With what was based here, would anything make a good museum ship for this area? If they could find a destroyer, that'd make an excellent museum ship for the Harwich area, with the Harwich force in World War One and so forth. But I don't think there's many World War One destroyers still around. That would be of a suitable time period. I think maybe the only one would be, I think the Thai Navy has a World War One era destroyer as a museum ship, but I don't think they're going to give that up anytime soon. Mike Magnuson, April of 2024 has a total solar eclipse that crosses a couple of museum ships, FYI. Okay, yeah, I mean, that's great. And if so, I probably would want to go and experience it. I've only experienced a near total solar eclipse in my lifetime so far. But, on the other hand, let's have a look back. 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. Okay. Planning for 2024 seems the mark of an incredible optimist to me at this point. I'm pretty sure by 2024 everything is going to be on fire. Or flooded, or possibly flooded and on fire at the rate that we're going. So enjoy it while it lasts. What do you think there's a reason I live where I do? I'm 400 feet above sea level. If we've got flooding around here in a big way, there's more problems than the fact there's flooding. Jamie Heffer says, I'm chairman of RAF Bircham Newton Heritage Centre in Norfolk. The airfield was run by Coastal Command during World War II, very involved in the Battle of the Atlantic. Oh, I'm very glad to hear that you've got that running. If it's ever possible for me to come down and have a look, please drop me a message by email or Discord. I'd love to come and have a look around at a Coastal Command airfield if it's at all possible. And chat has jumped again. Isn't this great? Nerd Caveman says, Drac, have you seen the video Gallagrim did on super hardened wood? It's in my watch later playlist, actually. If so, any thought as to how the tactical strategic situation could have changed the age of sail if the technology had existed then? As I said, I need to watch the video. It's in my watch later. I think I've actually technically played it through a few times because I used my watch later, apart from anything else, to help me go to sleep. So I have a feeling it's actually run through a couple of times whilst I'm asleep, but I do need to actually watch it while conscious at some point. Wow, everybody's been... very talkative. John South pointing out Byrne had twin-engine planes. Byrne operated a twin-engined aircraft. They were designing twin-engined aircraft for her as well. But as far as I'm aware, I don't think she ever operationally flew with significant numbers of twin-engine strike aircraft. Could be wrong though. I do need to have a bit more of a look into the details of Byrne's air group at some point. There we go. Da, da, da. Drake Marvel asks, who amongst the other World War II military YouTubers could you beat in a fight, armour and sword and just fists? I have no idea on the street fighting capability of most of the other World War II military history YouTubers. With armour and sword, I'd be a bit more confident of coming on the upper echelons of things, mainly because I actually do reenactment fighting and HEMA, so I at least know which end of a sword goes where. But then again, World War II history YouTubers, I'm pretty sure I don't think any of them have the same level of HEMA reenactment experience that I do, so I'd probably win that one with armour and swords. Military YouTubers generally, though, I mean, that technically includes the medieval ones, the medieval history covering ones, like Metatron and Scal and Matt Easton, of course, who teaches SG5 in Woking, which I attend, and I can absolutely guarantee you there is no way on this planet I'm ever beating Matt Easton in an armoured sword fighting contest. It might be entertaining to watch, but probably not for me. I know where my limits lie, and yeah, that my limits are far below that standard, let me tell you that much. Oh dear. Yeah, I mean, I'd put it this way. I did HEMA for 2 or 3 years. I think I got fairly good at it. For 2 or 3 years, just over a decade ago now. And I picked it up again this year. Okay, Matt's been doing HEMA before I started, and has been doing it continuously. That gives you some idea of the skill level differences there. And that's all my iron brew, so things are going a bit squilly. I think my sugar system has a few drops of blood left in it. Tokal 76, the question was about the modern MBT detonating a battleship magazine. I mean, theoretically, on paper, probably a modern tank shell has the penetration, but realistically I don't think so, because of the spacing. So again, I'm not an expert in modern tank ammunition, but from what I understand how the really high penetration sort of depleted uranium sabot stuff works, if you shot it at a battleship's magazine, it would probably happily go through the belt armor, but then at that point it would be self-igniting, probably tumbling, possibly coming apart, at which point it's got to get through a few bulkheads and then in its disintegrating state get through the barbette armor, which it probably won't do. I could be wrong. As I say, I don't know all that much about modern tank ammunition. So my guess is no, even though on paper that has the penetration because of that spacing effect. But possibly. Certainly, if an on-fire depleted uranium sabot gets into a magazine, there's not going to be a lot left afterwards. IO2. Now you've mentioned it, what choices are available for airsoft? Okay, I'll briefly cover that before we go back to the naval history. So airsoft, you have three main types of airsoft equipment. Apart from the HBA players, which we won't mention because, anyway, you have gas powered, which compressed gas doesn't work particularly well in cold weather, so not exactly the world's best option if you're playing in the UK. Limited ammunition counts, but possibly more realistic because of that. Sound really good as well. You have spring powered, which generally you only really tend to find in the snipers because obviously limited rate of fire. And you have electric, which tends to dominate the majority of the airsoft scene. So battery powered, NIMH batteries, LiPo batteries as well. LiPos are better, to be perfectly honest. And then obviously you have pistols. Pistols can be gas or electric, somewhat low velocity. Your standard rifles, automatic firing, low cap, mid cap, high cap magazines, anything from 30 rounds to 500 rounds per mag. And there's a very, very wide variety of available stuff for airsoft rifles. Then you have support weapons, MG42s, saws, that kind of thing, if you really, really want to hose down an area. And then at least on the sites, the open field sites that I play in the UK, as opposed to CQB areas, you also have DMRs, designated marksman rifles, which are somewhat higher velocity but semi-auto only. And then you have sniper rifles, which are the highest velocity and single shot only, i.e. you have to reload after each shot. Although there are a couple of electric sniper rifles. I'd have to ask them about what their policy is on that. So yeah, those are the broad choices available for airsoft. But I don't want this to become the airsoft stream. Apart from anything else, if I start getting the airsoft collection out on this stream, you can guarantee YouTube will demonetize it when half a army's arsenal comes floating across the screen. Jake Miller, when are we getting a 5-minute guide on your pets? Unfortunately, nowadays I don't have any pets. Did for a very long time, but the harvest mice and the gerbils have all gradually passed away over the past year and a half, so we are currently without pets, unfortunately. At some point I might put up a little montage video to them all, because they're all very cute. The last one to go was Mac the gerbil about a week or two ago. Daniel Moore asks, does Mrs. Drack have any interest in naval history? She does now. More by osmosis than anything else, but she did have before as well. A little bit of one, but I'm not sure, she's beginning to adopt a lot of the stuff I talk about in naval history. I think because she just hears me talk about it so much. I mean, back when I started doing medieval reenactment, one of the things that I do during the living history portions is I'm an archer. I'm portraying an archer who's a direct ancestor of mine. But therefore I spend a lot of time talking to people about longbows and arrows and making bows and arrows and how they perform and what they do, etc. And then one day I was completely shattered, so I lay down for a bit in the tent to relax. And then I heard the dulcet tones of Mrs. Drack, basically word for word saying everything I've been saying for the past year and a half to an interested visitor. Because, yeah, it turns out if you're around me long enough, you'll eventually either go mad or you'll start repeating back what I'm saying. To be fair, I've learned a lot from her about stuff that she's interested in and places that than where she's from, like South Africa. So it's a two-way street. Cameron Turnbull, how overpowered were the G3 designs compared to their expected adversaries? And why didn't the British revisit this design for the King George V when everyone else was cheating on the Washington Naval Treaty? So the G3s compared to the Amagis and the Lexingtons were pretty overpowered. They were competitive in speed, they were competitive in armament, and they had by a significant way, superior armour. They were really fast battleships. Why they didn't resurrect the G3 design when everyone was cheating on the Washington Naval Treaty? Well, the King George V were designed to be treaty compliant. The next step, the escalator clause thing, because remember the G3s are massively overweight for the Washington Naval Treaty restrictions. And when it comes to designing a new capital ship, you could in theory say, yeah, they could have dusted off the G3 designs for the Lion class, effectively. But at the same time, things had moved on a little bit. Whilst the G3s, as designed, yeah, they probably would have been pretty effective. They were now having to take into account radar. They were having to take into account aircraft facilities initially. They were having to take into account the much more extended dual-purpose secondary armament that they required for anti-aircraft use, and the light and medium anti-aircraft armament as well. All of this would affect how you would design a ship, and so instead you got the Lion class, which, to be honest, being adaptations of work done for the King George V, which was more immediate, was probably actually slightly quicker to put together than trying to dust off a design. You know, the people who'd worked on that were now 20 years older, possibly retired. Thor's X says, I know firearms ownership is restrictive in the UK, however, do you shoot? I don't. Not if you like, quote unquote, real life guns, gunpowder weaponry. So in the UK, you have, broadly speaking, if you want to own an actual firearm as opposed to an air rifle, you have two kinds of licenses. You have a shotgun license and you have a firearms license. And the requirements both to have a firearms license or firearms certificate and to maintain it are much, much, much greater, and to get one in the first place are much greater than a shotgun license. If I wanted a shotgun license, I could get one pretty easily. Don't have a criminal record, could make the requisite adjustments to store a shotgun. It's not that difficult. Whereas, firearms license vetting is quite extensive. And the amount of paperwork and legwork you'd have to go through, and some of the specific stuff you have to do, like be a member of a shooting club and so forth, and the safety measures you have to take. I could do it if I wanted to, but I don't feel that strongly about it to be bothered, to be honest. Jack Duckfield, part 3 of the Nelson series is hopefully spring next year. Alright, I'm now out of Iron Brew, so I'll probably start wrapping it up in the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. I'm going to scroll through a little bit. See if I can catch up on some of what the latest stuff is saying. Troutco 1388. If the 1908 German naval law doesn't happen and the Kaiserliche Marine keeps making just 2 battleships and a battlecruiser per year, does that affect Royal Navy building? Probably not, because if they're building 3 capital ships a year and the Royal Navy's building 5, that's i.e. 4 battleships and a battlecruiser, that's probably about the ratio that they need to maintain the level of superiority they want. So they're probably just going to keep going. With their construction. You might not get the We Want 8 and We Won't Wait campaign, but the general trend of the Royal Navy building 5 capital ships a year, I don't think is going to change all that much. Paul Paulus Plain says, if you're interested in the David Webb books, Out of the Dark and Into the Light series, it covers space, naval, orbital bombardment pretty well. Okay, I'll take a look when I get the chance. I'm not necessarily guaranteeing when that will be, considering the various things I have to deal with on my plate over the next few months, but it's certainly slightly less hectic than the past few months. Megascrow. A virtual audio tour when you're there. A virtual audio tour for the museums. Yeah, I mean, if there's a museum ship or museum out there that obviously naval related, that wants me to do record a virtual audio tour for them, I'm perfectly happy to do that. That'd be absolutely great. The idea of so many people having to listen to my voice if they want to learn things. Pat van der Riest says, I know there's a huge list ahead of us, but I'd love to get a Wednesday special on the use of rigid airships for naval operations. Yeah, that's something I definitely do want to talk about at some point. Yeah, so I'm just rapid scrolling, trying to catch up with the chat up here. I've got to have gotten quite a fair bit behind. A lot of people pointing out apparently I should try and fight Lindy Page. That'd be interesting. He's a lot taller than me. Then again, he's a lot taller than most people. Yeah, I've only seen him twice on the same day at Tankfest. Be interesting to chat to him at some point. Thank you very much, Jamie Heffer. I just caught up with that bit. So, yep, hopefully I'll be going to Coastal Command Airfield at some point in the future. That'd be nice. Huzzah. Daniel Taylor, can you beat Metatron in a pasta eating contest? Probably not. I would like to talk to Metatron about the Roman Navy at some point, though. I have a Roman Navy specialist lined up as well, but it'd be very interesting to have a chat with Metatron about some of the Roman Navy stuff. Smiling Ned says, don't fight Chieftain. No, if the Chieftain knows... Actually, having been a soldier, I'm pretty sure the Chieftain knows how to fight, and also is taller than me. But I'm, as I said, I'm also fairly certain that he is not so experienced in... Well, actually, no, that's the thing. He does know how to fight in armour, except the kind of armour that Chieftain fights in is a tank. And I don't think my Agincourt era plate armour is going to do me many favours if he's chasing me in an M1A2. Oh, dear. Yeah, that's a little bit of a technicality there. Aluminium fence, does this now mean you can get a cat? No. Sorry. Sorry, cat people, but no. No. I like some cats. I've had experience of having a cat in my house. It's not an experience I want to repeat. And to be perfectly honest, I like the local wildlife a lot more than I'd like having a cat. If I was going to get any pet at the moment, I think it would either be possibly some rats, a little collection of rats, because they're quite cute and intelligent, or it would be an Irish wolfhound, because they're just awesome. And we live close enough to somewhere that has a decent walking range, there's a decent area for walking. But even so, I think if I was going to get something that required walking and large amounts of activity, like a dog or something, I would want to live in an area where I had more space to do that on my own property, rather than the postage stamp of the back garden that I have now. Mike Upton, 5-minute guide to Drax model ship collection. That I don't think is possible, unless I was just like, here's this fleet, and there's that fleet, and there's that fleet, and this fleet, and this fleet, and this fleet, and I'd basically be doing that for 5 minutes, and that would be that guide. Reading Railroad fan, how does Mrs. Drac put up with you, and how did it go when you first met? Thank you very much, Paul is playing. How does Mrs. Drac put up with you? Well, that's a very good question. Mrs. Drac, yeah. How do you put up with me? This is a question that chat wishes to know.
I dose your iron brew when you're not looking.
Oh, okay. Apparently that's a thing. Oh, dear. How did it go when you first met up? She pulled a knife on me, and that's all I'm going to say. That's a story that's only reserved for people who meet me in person, because it's a very funny story, and on the surface it sounds terrible, but was actually far, far funnier. Oh dear. It's a fun time. The bench press man, if you want to see HMS Victory, you'll want to be in Portsmouth. If you go to Southampton to see HMS Victory, you are going to be sorely disappointed. Palais Rasmussen. Yeah, we had ferrets a while ago. We had a couple of ferrets. I think the ferrets would be a decent halfway house between. They're obviously considerably longer lived than small rodents, but don't require quite the same amount of outdoor recreational activity as a dog does. So they might do relatively well. I would have to consult with Mrs. Drac though, because yeah. Ferrets, as you know, you put an awful lot into ferrets, and Mrs. Drac would definitely want to have a good long say about that. Carl von Gazenberg says, given your relationship to green food, do not get a bunny. I don't know, the bunny might be the only thing in the house that eats green food. Grey Ghost, how tall are you in inches and feet? 6 foot nothing, apparently. It varies between 5'11" and 6 foot, depending on the day. Although it would appear sometimes. Although, yeah, now I'm not carrying massive heavy bags for work. It's not too bad. Scooter JSP, if the Imperial Japanese Navy had somehow won the battle and captured Midway, what utility could they have gotten from it, and how long could they have realistically held it? Probably not got too much utility from it. It'll probably end up being like Wake Island. It'll be a heavily armed garrison that the US may or may not decide to bypass. It would depend, but I think it would depend largely on what they did with it. If they just kind of held it and expected the US to come to them, the US would probably just ignore them and pick them up afterwards, like they did with Wake. If they managed to base a significant number of aircraft out of it, then the US would have to move in to retake it in some way. Ramal, can you do an in-depth analysis about the US Navy's fast carrier task force, the origins of the formations, tactics and logistics? At some point, sure. I don't see why not. Be a bit of a while though, because it's a specific formation in a specific conflict is a little bit further down the list than talking about, you know, the course of a particular service throughout a conflict, or the development of an entire class of ships and so forth. TCN, how about giraffes? I don't think I could fit a giraffe in this house. I think a giraffe could look over my roof, if I'm remembering the giraffes I've seen before. Jake Miller, would you consider coming to New Zealand? No museum ships, but plenty of naval aircraft. At some point, sure. I mean, at some point, I definitely want to visit Australia after I've made myself completely poisonous creature proof. Yeah, it's... Yeah, I want to go and see Australia because they do have a fair number of museum ships there, surprisingly enough. And it's a relatively short hop over to New Zealand, so I could incorporate that as part of the tour. But that would definitely be for 2023 or later. Certainly not before. Thoughts on the Zumwalt class? That's best reserved for bilge pumps. Okay, I think because I'm out of Iron Brew, it's been just over 3 hours and I'm beginning to run out of voice, so I'm going to do maybe half a dozen more questions. Mr. Serenity's End asks, you mentioned in a dry dock that 6-inch quad turret, one of the reasons 6-inch quad turrets don't work is because they probably end up firing too often. What's the smallest caliber that does make sense as a quad? Battleship, basically, battleship calibers. And that's down, again, to rate of fire. Basically, with battleship caliber guns, the rate of fire is low enough that you can usually guarantee that you'll have all 4 guns loaded and ready to go at any given time. If you're looking at anything below that, unless you're using some very, very special engineering, or you're doing the French kind of a pair of twin turrets in very close formation thing, yeah, otherwise, other than that, quad turrets, there's just there's too many unpredictables for rapid fire quads, certainly with World War II tech. Sean M, do you want to return to engineering, or is naval historiography your thing? I think I much prefer naval history. It's something I always wanted to get into, but back when I think, as I said on some of the live streams, back when I was going to university, I was good at engineering, and it seemed to have much better career prospects at the time. And also, to be fair, most engineering is done by working for companies or local authorities, which is what I spent my professional career doing when I was an engineer. I mean, I technically still am an engineer, all the paperwork and everything. But that means office politics, deadlines, pointless rigmarole, running around, filling in pointless forms, going on pointless training courses, trying to account for time. People don't appreciate generally making things work or improving your system so I can actually do my job. They don't like that when you try and enter that on timesheets. So, whereas with naval history, I am pretty much my own boss. And although, yeah, I'd say it's strange, because as your own boss, you'd think you'd want to take more time off. And yeah, I can occasionally just turn around and say, right, I'm having this day off. Great, fantastic. And I don't have to ask anyone else about it. But at the same time, I think overall, I probably put a lot more work hours into this than I ever did into my day-to-day job, because my day-to-day job when I was an engineer, it was, I go to work, I kind of resent not being paid for the commute, but whatever. I'll go to work, I'll work my 7 or 8 hours a day, and I'll come home, and the minute I step outside that office, I'm not working. You can phone me, email me, whatever, but if you do that 1 minute after I step out the office, you ain't getting a reply till I get back in. Whereas, yeah, I might just wake up one morning and go, look, I'm just not up to doing anything today. I'm taking the day off, and then I won't do something that day, like say a Thursday. But then, 2 days before, I might have gotten up at 6 in the morning because, I don't know, the postman showed up unseasonably early, and just gone, you know what, I'm going to start script writing, I'm going to start researching, I'm going to start video editing, and I might still be there at 10 o'clock at night, quite happily going away because I enjoy this. I think this is the thing with engineering. I'm good at it, and I like doing it, but I only like doing it in as much as you let me get on with the blasted job. And most engineering jobs, as I say, you have to get involved in all this office politics and stuff and other pointless stuff, which I don't like. Whereas with naval history, for the most part, I just get to do what I like doing. So I think, unless anything really, really dramatic happens, I'm doing this for as long as it lasts. The Ugly Steve asks, if you were fighting a fictional demon-crewed fleet from the depths of hell, which 3 captains or admirals would you have in your navy? Well, if I'm fighting the supernatural, I can't recall which admirals had supernatural powers to counter the enemy. I mean, Drake, you've got Drake with Drake's drum. Apparently that has some kind of supernatural power. So and the Spanish called him El Draco and thought he had a magic mirror. So, yeah, I'll take Francis Drake because apparently that might work. I mean, the Spanish Armada was blessed by the Pope. Then again, we know what happened to the Spanish Armada, so I don't think that's going to help. I mean, what else could you do? And take Fisher, just because Fisher will go berserk and distract them for a while. So Fisher and Drake, certainly. Fisher, Drake, and King. So Drake has the supposedly supernatural powers, and you combine the rage of Fisher and King into some kind of like glowing orb of pure destruction. That'll probably deal with pretty much anything in their way. Brian Savage, could the U-boats have brought Britain to her knees? In theory, yes. In practice, in World War II, no. They didn't come too close. They were worried, but the U-boats in World War II were never that close to putting Britain on her knees. World War I, however, they were. World War I's one of the things that people don't really sometimes realise is that in World War II, the Admiralty at points was looking at, especially in 42 and early 43, was looking at it going, over the course of the war, if this loss rate keeps up, it's not sustainable and we could be in trouble. Whereas in World War I, especially in things like 1917, the Admiralty was looking at things going, if this keeps up for a few more weeks, we're out of the war. That's the difference of the level of threat. So, yeah, U-boat campaign in World War I, could have brought Britain to her knees and forced her out of the war. World War II, close but no cigar. Steve Dunbar, thank you very much. I'm glad to have been of assistance. Megas Gross says, I should go to Australia wearing my plate armour, then no snake can bite me. Theoretically, yes. Then I'm left wearing plate armour in the Australian sun. Dead of heat stroke in about 15 minutes. I did once fight in 35-degree temperatures wearing plate armour. Mrs. Drack took a picture of me afterwards. I looked like a steam locomotive. There is literally steam pouring from every single joint of the armour because I soaked my gambeson in ice water beforehand, and I was the only one who didn't pass out of heat because of heat stroke as a result. Sean, yes, I do seem to like being a naval historian more. Thank you very much. Right. Nathan Cassidy says there's a Thornycroft torpedo boat at Littleton. Okay. Well, I guess that might work. Reading Railroad Fan, why was South Dakota chosen over North Carolina and Washington to be a flagship when she was already cramped due to her size? Because they included extra provisions in her superstructure, extra cabin space, etc. for an admiral's flagstaff. She was specifically built as a flagship, as a result of which she's the easiest one to distinguish of the 4 South Dakota class because she only has 8 5-inch 38 gun mountings as opposed to all the others having 10. Because I sacrificed 2 of them for more crew quarters. Hamish McGregor says, wouldn't an 8-inch quad be slow enough firing? Theoretically, yes, I would say. But the weird thing is an 8-inch quad makes more sense on a late 20s, early 30s treaty cruiser when the rate of fire is slower. By the time you get to World War II, especially the mid to latter parts where they're looking at autoloaders, it starts to become far more problematic. Scooter JSP pointing out that an Australia trip could mean collaboration with Shad. Yes, as long as he doesn't stick me in a barrel and shove me into a freezing cold lake. Thank you very much, Sean V. Knight 6831, how likely is it that Hood would have her repairs done in the US, given Hitler would likely be gunning for her, given her fame? You mean if she was damaged and survived the Battle of the Denmark Strait? It's entirely possible. Quite a lot of capital ships were being repaired in the US at that point. Just for the case of getting her repaired, it would be a good idea to have her sent to the States at that point. Dale Harper, would you ever be interested in doing a video that covered the Sodak style refit of Tennessee, California, and West Virginia? Yeah, at some point. That definitely does need to be covered. I mean, I think I would probably do that video before I did a video on Surigao Strait so that people knew where I was coming from when I talked about the upgrades. Put it all in context. Brian Wilson, are you planning to visit USS Midway when you eventually make your US trip? Yes, very definitely. Kay, is there a video about the Merchant Navy in World War II? Not at the moment, unfortunately. Jack Grimble, Admiral Yee, the guy with the turtle ships. As I've said before, I would want to talk with someone who was an expert on him, because of the, relatively speaking, limited amount of decent information in English language sources. I've tried to reach out to a couple of Korean experts on Admiral Yi, haven't had any reply. So I'm moving on to other things until someone does pop up. Cap 198462. Wait, you're a civil engineer, not an electromechanical engineer. Officially, I'm a civil engineer. But the only thing I would say is, okay, so the way the university system works in the UK, or at least the way it worked at the university that I went to, is that each semester, obviously you have 2 semesters a year, the degree is 3 years, unless you do a year in industry, then it's 4 years, but whatever. So each semester you have 4 modules, and each of those modules carried a code that went with it. Some of those modules were coded CE. Those were civil engineering specific modules. Most of the rest were coded EN, which were general engineering modules. And a couple of them actually were actually coded with other courses. Like there was an ME module, which was a materials engineering module, but we still had to learn that. And the idea was basically that you'd learn your degree specific stuff, in my case civil engineering, but some stuff was applicable across multiple engineering degrees, and so that would be taught under the general EN modules. But what this meant was that the lecturers got used to seeing a lot of different people from a lot of different courses within a single lecture, so they didn't spend a huge amount of time paying attention to exactly who was in each class, because like, oh yeah, I recognize that guy, he's in one of my classes, whatever. University lecturers, which meant that because I was interested in mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering, aeronautical engineering, etc., and as most people who've done a university degree course will appreciate, compared to high school, there's a lot of free periods. A lot of the time, if I had, say, engineering materials first and second session, and then I had one class of structures in the 6th session. So you have like 2 sessions, 2 classes, then a break, 2 classes lunch, 2 classes go home. That's the maximum you can have. So if I had, say, class 1 and 2 and class 6, quite often I'd find myself bored, and I'd figure out where some of the other classes that I was interested in, like materials engineering, mechanical engineering, where they were being held, just usually by asking the people who are in the general engineering classes, and I'd sneak into the back of some of their lectures and listen to them. So I think during my time doing my civil engineering course, I kind of also listened to about half of the classes for mechanical and materials engineering degrees as well. So my engineering knowledge is a little bit broader than just purely the civil engineering side. But yes, technically on paper I'm a civil engineer. IO2, if you had to prevent the near 10-year-long disaster of the post-war refit of HMS Victorious and others like it, how would you do it? I think I've said before, the way I'd do it is get them to build the Maltas. Build the 4 Maltas plus Ark Royal and Eagle, and get rid of everything else except for maybe a couple of Centaurs. That would be my approach. Okay, last 2 questions. USS Grey Ghost, how effective would a 28-knot Leon have been to the Free French and or help the US in the Pacific, refitted with both radar types and refitted with AA? Assuming it went to the Free French, considering what most of the French battleships did, but assuming that a fast 28-knot Leon was developed and was put and went over to the Free French early in the war, it would have been very useful because it would have been another fast capital ship with a lot of firepower. And it wouldn't, I don't think they would have been with the US fleet in the Pacific, but you'd probably see a hypothetical 28-knot Leon probably would be fighting in the Mediterranean. So then once the Mediterranean conflict wrapped up, it would probably be part, like Richelieu was historically, of the Eastern Fleet that translated into the British Pacific Fleet, so available in the latter stages of the Pacific campaign. Sean M. I personally am a somewhat civil anti-royal engineer. Actually, I do electronic stuff in the USA. Thanks for the videos. I enjoy them. And thank you very much. And nice to see a fellow engineer out there. IO2, if you can't get the Maltas built, Megascrow, officially you only make targets. Yes, one of my friends does constantly point out, because he has a mechanical engineering degree, he makes the weapons, I make the targets. It's true. It's true. Daryl Frost, huge crossover between civil and maritime engineering and materials sciences. You know, yes, very much so. I do like me some materials science. Han YOLO, naval foods of the 1800s follow up for other big navies at the time. When? Maybe some point next year. I'll find myself some wine for a French one. Yeah, if it's popular enough, if people think it's a good enough idea, I might do another, maybe French naval rations. That's always interesting. IoT, if you can't get the Maltas built. Okay, so if I can't get the Maltas built, so I've got Ark Royal and Eagle. Trying to persuade them not to do Victorious at that point. It's going to be a bit harder. I think I would probably use the argument of we've got the Centaurs, and they're going to be a lot easier to rework than the armoured carriers. I know we've got Victorious, yes, okay, fine, but, and I know you want the experience to test it all out, fine, but test it on one of the Centaurs first, and then, if necessary, apply it to something like Implacable. Don't bother with Victoria. She's not going to be in service long enough, basically. But if you're constrained with what else you can build, it is going to be a bit of an uphill struggle to stop them doing it, because the whole reason they tried to do it on Victorious first was to see what lessons they could learn to then do it to Implacable. well, both Implacables, and then it turned out actually they did it so hilariously badly that they weren't allowed to do anything to anything else. Okay. Right, well, with that, I think it's probably time to wrap up this stream. Apologies to those of you whose questions I didn't get to. There's just so many questions. I tried to get through as many as possible. And yeah, once again, thank you very much for listening. Hope you've had a good day. We are very nearly at the end of 2021, so let's see what 2022 brings us. I'm well protected enough. I'm prepared. I'm not letting it sneak up on me like the last few years have. And yeah, enjoy your afternoons, evenings, mornings, whatever you might be enjoying across the world. And I will see you again in another video. Bye-bye.